Hey guys, tonight we begin a slow and fragrant walk through time, right along the banks of the Nile River, where the air is damp with history and just a little sticky with morning mist. And the scent of mud, papyrus, and something sweeter, something floral, floats just above the water, like a memory you can almost touch. You stand barefoot in the silt, the grains soft between your toes, and watch the lotus flowers bob ever so lazily in the gentle current, their petals a little sleepy still, not quite open, not quite closed, as if they're still deciding whether the day is worth blooming for. The frogs haven't stopped croaking since the night before, and one mosquito buzzes uncomfortably close to your ear. But you barely notice, because your mind is somewhere else entirely. On the invisible perfumes carried on the warm breeze, on the rituals and recipes whispered through the reeds, on the people who believed that if the world must smell of anything, it ought to smell like heaven, and that heaven itself might smell exactly like a lotus flower, just beginning to bloom. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop your location and local time in the comments. I always love seeing where and when you're listening. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. The thing about ancient Egypt is that it's full of surprises, even when absolutely nothing exciting is happening. Which, for you at the moment, is ideal. You're not storming pyramids. You're not meeting pharaohs. And no, you're definitely not surviving some epic curse carved in hieroglyphs on a hidden tomb wall. You're simply walking, slow and barefoot, along a muddy river path, squinting at the water where wide green pads float, their glossy skin wobbling ever so gently under the weight of pale pink and bluish-white lotus blooms. The sun hasn't quite made its way over the palm trees yet, and that's a good thing, because the moment it does, it'll become far too hot to harvest anything without sweating through your linen tunic before breakfast. You bend down to touch one of the flowers, gently, respectfully, because while it may look delicate, this particular bloom has endured for centuries. Not this literal flower, of course, but the species, the symbol, the sacred metaphor. The lotus has been called the flower of rebirth, of the sun, of creation itself, which honestly sounds like a lot of pressure for a plant that spends most of its day floating. Still, the symbolism is strong. It closes at night, sinks underwater, and rises again each morning to bloom anew, making it the botanical equivalent of hitting the snooze button on reincarnation. In temples, priests murmur its name in hymns. In palaces, perfumers chase its essence. In papyrus scrolls, its image is sketched 100 times over. And here you are, ankle deep in squelchy mud, just trying to pick a few good ones before the other collectors beat you to the best blooms. You reach for the stem, slowly, because snails love to curl themselves under the leaves, and pull a flower free, dripping and perfect. You place it gently into the woven reed basket slung over your arm, its bottom already damp from the weight of the early haul. The scent is faint but unmistakable. A soft sweetness with something earthy beneath, like honey left on a windowsill or the skin of a fruit you've never quite tasted. It's subtle now, but, With enough work and patience, this humble bloom will become something truly exquisite. As you move farther along the bank, eyes scanning for fresh blossoms, the mist begins to lift, and with it comes the noise of morning life. A barge creaks somewhere on the river, loaded with jars of fish oil and crates of dates. Children shriek in the distance as they chase each other between the trees, their laughter high and bright, while a heron watches them with the tired expression of someone who has lived through far too many sunrises to care. Even the crocodiles, those half-submerged rulers of the shallows, seem too lazy to move just yet, blinking slowly as the heat begins to rise. You've been doing this long enough to know which flowers are best for perfume making. The ones too open have released most of their scent. The ones too closed are still holding it hostage. It's the half-awake blossoms you want. The ones just starting to yawn if flowers yawn, and stretch their petals out with the tentative optimism of someone poking their head outside to check the weather before committing to a walk. The fragrance is stronger in the early morning, and the oils more accessible before the heat scorches the petals into submission. There's no time to waste. You move rhythmically now, not quickly, but efficiently. Snip, pluck, place, step. Your basket filling with the lightest of burdens. Flowers soft as folded linen. Stems still damp with river water. Some say the perfume of the lotus has magical properties. Others insist it's just the brain playing tricks, layering memories of summer and stories of gods onto the faintest of smells. But you've seen the way the priestesses inhale deeply before prayer, the way noble women close their eyes when a new oil is uncorked, and the way even the grumpiest old merchant in the perfume quarter will pause, just briefly, if a drop of lotus oil lands on his wrist. Magic or not, it changes the air. It hushes it. There's a man in the village who claims that the very first perfume ever made was an offering to the gods, a liquid hymn of crushed petals and smoke, poured over altars in a time before time. Perfume, he says, is not just for the body. It's for the soul's memory. He also says fish can dream. So you take his wisdom with a grain of natron. You round a bend in the river where the reeds grow tall and thick, blocking out the rising sun. Here it's cooler, darker, and the flowers are fewer, but purer somehow, as though they've been hiding on purpose, waiting for someone patient enough to find them. You pick the last few blooms with care, tucking them into your basket, and then sit on a flat stone half buried in the mud, letting your legs dangle lazily into the water. You lean back slightly and breathe. You wonder how many others have sat exactly here, on this very stone, in centuries past. Perhaps another perfumer once watched the same herons fly overhead, or another collector lean down to wash the sticky yellow pollen from their fingers. It's comforting, in a way, to be part of a long, slow chain of motion, of reaching and picking and blending and bottling, all in service of a smell that almost no one remembers by name, but everyone remembers by heart. The day has properly begun now. The sun is climbing, the water shimmers with golden heat, and the petals in your basket have started to wilt ever so slightly, their edges curling inward, like they, too, are shy of the light. Time to head back, you suppose, and begin the next step. Because this is only the start, the prelude, the gathering, and there's still a long, fragrant road ahead before this river flower becomes a tiny glass bottle on someone's vanity, or a drop on a noblewoman's wrist, or a final kiss goodbye pressed onto a linen burial cloth. You rise slowly, stretch your back with a small groan, and begin the walk back to the village. Each step soft and squelchy. The basket swinging gently at your side, filled with sleepy little blossoms that, like you, will soon be transformed. By the time you return to the courtyard, the sun is fully awake, already pressing down with the kind of weight that makes linen cling to your back and sand cling to your sandals, though in this moment, you're more focused on balancing your basket than worrying about sweat, because inside are the precious lotus blooms, still damp from the Nile, their fragrance already beginning to mingle softly with the heavier scents of the morning air, the scorched dust, the distant puff of bread baking, the faint tang of copper and wax from the neighbor's workshop. And all of it blends into something you might call home, if home could ever be defined by scent alone. The courtyard is quiet, shaded by high mud brick walls that keep the worst of the heat at bay. And in the center stands a low stone table, smooth from years of use, surrounded by jars, shallow trays, and one very determined cat who seems to think the petals are a new kind of fish. You set the basket down carefully and begin to sort through the blooms, lifting each flower by the base of its stem, inspecting the petals for signs of bruising or insect nibbles, then laying them gently onto a linen cloth stretched over a wide tray, its weave loose enough to let air through, but tight enough to catch the pollen. It's important to do this before the sun gets too high. Everyone says so, though no one entirely agrees on why. Some say the heat burns away the essence. Others claim the gods only bless the early harvests. And a few argue that it's simply tradition, which in Egypt often carries more weight than explanation. As you work, you find yourself falling into a rhythm that is both familiar and strangely comforting, like the slow beat of a drum in the distance, a kind of domestic ritual passed down not through scrolls or ceremonies, but through hands, hands that press, hands that crush, hands that pour and stir and wait. You hum quietly as you go, not because anyone told you to, but because your grandmother once said that humming keeps the flowers calm. And even though you suspect she made that up to get you to stop complaining as a child, it's a tradition you now keep without question. The sun creeps higher. Somewhere nearby, a goat bleats in protest at being asked to move. The cat finally gives up and stretches itself into a warm, purring puddle in the shade of an empty amphora. And you? You begin the first step of the transformation. There's no fire yet, no boiling, no mysterious oils or exotic resins. Just you, a stone grinding slab, and a small granite roller, worn smooth from years of use, that you grip with both hands as you lean your weight into the motion, slowly pressing the petals into a pulpy, fragrant mash. The process is repetitive, but not boring, at least not if you surrender to it fully. The weight of the roller, the slight resistance of the petals, the soft squelch as their cells break open. It's all oddly satisfying, like kneading dough or peeling bark or shelling beans on a hot afternoon. It is work that demands your attention, but not your urgency. Petals are slippery things when crushed, and the juice they release isn't as dramatic as you'd expect. Just a faint, yellowish moisture, more suggestion than substance. You scrape it into a shallow dish and keep going, adding more petals, grinding slowly, methodically, until the whole tray has been transformed into a soft, damp mixture that smells richer now, fuller, as though the flower's true character only reveals itself after it has been gently destroyed. There's a lesson in that somewhere, you think, though you're too warm and too focused to dig for it right now. Once the last batch has been ground, you set the paste aside and wipe your hands on a cloth that has seen better days. Several, in fact. You glance toward the corner of the courtyard where the clay pots are stored, each marked with a symbol scratched into the surface, a language of oil and scent that only those in the trade really understand. You know the one you need. The jar with the faded circle and double loop, signifying sweet almond oil, aged just long enough to be ready, but not so long that it starts to taste like old figs. You carry it over with care and uncork it slowly, letting the aroma rise up. Nutty, mellow, almost buttery. It's not the star of the show, but it will carry the lotus, preserve it, cradle it through time like a mother holding a sleeping child. Some people use castor oil, others prefer moringa, but almond has always been your favorite. Less assertive, more yielding, a quiet kind of oil that listens more than it speaks. You pour a thin layer into a wide-mouthed bowl, then add the lotus mash by the spoonful, watching it sink slowly, curling into the oil like ink dropped in water. There's no rush. You stir gently with a smooth wooden paddle, folding the oil and flour together, not blending, not mixing, just encouraging them to become acquainted. The scent deepens immediately, from airy and floral to something rounder, almost creamy, with just a whisper of the river still clinging to the edges. If you close your eyes, you can almost imagine a breeze moving through papyrus reeds, or the muffled splash of a hippo somewhere upstream. Once everything is combined, you cover the bowl with a square of linen and place it in the coolest corner of the courtyard, next to the water jars, beneath the shade of a fig tree that may or may not have been planted by your great-grandmother, depending on which family story you believe. It will sit there for at least a day, maybe 2, maybe 3, depending on the weather and your mood, and whether or not the cat decides to sit on it. There are no precise measurements here, no timers or scales, only instinct, tradition, and a nose trained to know when something is ready, which is often defined as smells less like goat and more like divine gift from the gods. Historians still argue whether ancient Egyptian perfumers truly understood the chemistry behind what they were doing, or whether it was all just luck, repetition, and trial by sneeze. But the truth is probably somewhere in between. There are recipes. Oh yes, recipes scratched onto scrolls and walls and bits of pottery. But they read more like poetry than instruction, filled with phrases like gather under Ra's eye and crush until silence, which isn't particularly helpful if you're looking for exact proportions. Still, the results speak for themselves. Even today, archaeologists unearthing tombs have reported catching faint traces of fragrance when opening sealed jars. After thousands of years, the perfume still lingers, like the ghost of a memory that refuses to fade. As you sit back and stretch your arms, your muscles pleasantly sore from the grinding, you allow yourself a small moment of pride. You didn't invent this method, and you certainly won't be the last to use it. But there's something deeply satisfying about being part of a tradition that has outlasted empires, wars, plagues, and fashion trends. Perfume, after all, doesn't care who's pharaoh or which god is in favor. It only asks to be made and worn and remembered. You take a final sniff of your mixture, still a little sharp, but promising, and then gather your tools to wash. The stone slab goes first, rinsed carefully with water from the jar, scrubbed with a bundle of stiff papyrus stems. Then the roller, then the spoon, each laid out to dry in the sun. The sun, of course, is unforgiving, and by now, it's high enough to make the walls of the courtyard glow with reflected heat. You retreat into the shade, wiping your forehead with your sleeve, and sit on a low stool, watching the oil slowly soak up the scent of the crushed flowers. Drop by drop, hour by hour. Somewhere nearby, a flute begins to play. A slow, wandering melody that spirals up into the sky and disappears. The cat yawns and shifts positions, then yawns again for good measure. You close your eyes and breathe deeply. The smell of lotus, now mingling with almond, with sweat, with stone, with morning. It is the smell of now, of here, of this precise moment in a courtyard, somewhere between the Nile and forever. And you know, in your bones, that this is only the beginning. The next morning arrives, not with the sudden brightness of revelation, but with the slow, familiar roll of warmth pressing in from the east. A gentle swell of gold that spills over the edge of the courtyard wall and creeps steadily across the stone floor, illuminating dust motes and lazy insects and the soft outlines of yesterday's labor, which now waits, silent and fragrant, under its linen cover, having spent the long night marinating in its own transformation. You rise slowly, as though afraid to startle the moment, and move toward the bowl where the oil and lotus mixture rests. The linen now dappled with tiny stains, where some of the essence has risen and kissed the fabric from beneath. You lift the cloth carefully, like unveiling a sacred object, which, in a way, this is. And immediately, the scent greets you. Not overwhelming, not brash, but deep and steady and surprisingly rich, like something that has known secrets for a very long time. There is a stillness to this part of the process, a reverence even, as though the act of filtering the oil from the mash should be done without speaking, without thinking too loudly, for fear of disturbing the fragile balance between what was and what could be. You reach for the fine mesh strainer woven from softened reeds and line it with a square of clean linen. Real linen, not the reused, patched together kind, preserved for wiping spills or covering jars of pickled onions. But the good cloth, smooth and strong and free from the lingering smell of last week's vinegar disaster. You place it over a narrow-necked amphora, positioning it carefully so nothing spills, and then begin to pour the mixture through, slowly, letting gravity do most of the work, resisting the urge to poke or press, because the scent must move at its own pace. And because the more you rush it, the more you risk clouding the oil with unwanted residue. Bit by bit, the golden liquid drips through, forming a thin stream that catches the sunlight just enough to glow like melted amber. And with each drop, the smell grows stronger, rounder, more cohesive, as if the spirit of the lotus has finally agreed to stay a while, to settle down in this vessel and call it home. The pulp left behind in the cloth is set aside, not wasted, never wasted, because even though its prime has passed, it still holds a little fragrance, a little history, and will be used in cheaper blends or rubbed hot onto linen sachets that perfumers tuck into baskets of clothing, into storage jars, or under pillows where children dream of temples and talking animals and cities carved from sand. You wipe your hands, the oil slick and warm on your fingers, and seal the amphora with a small wax stopper, melted from a stubby candle and pressed smooth with the heel of your hand. It's not quite finished yet. This is only the first infusion, but it's a beginning, a base upon which layers will be added, each step coaxing a deeper note from the flower's elusive heart. You place the amphora in the shade beside yesterday's tools and begin preparing for the next round, because today you will begin the second pressing, the refining, and the slow dance between scent and substance will continue, just as it always has. You gather more petals, this time not from the riverbank, but from a pile delivered earlier by a boy with dusty feet and a basket slung over his back, who swore he picked them himself, but smelled suspiciously of palm wine, suggesting that either he's fibbing or the lotuses grow beside a tavern. Still, the blooms are fresh enough, and you spread them on the stone table, admiring their sleepy elegance, their quiet determination to open fully even after being plucked from their watery cradle. You begin the grinding again, slower this time, more mindful, letting the weight of the granite roller do most of the work as the petals collapse under your hands, their fragrance already bolder thanks to yesterday's layering. The process is meditative, even hypnotic, and you find your thoughts drifting, not toward anything urgent, but toward the past, toward stories told by your uncle after dinner, when the sky turned purple and the frogs sang lullabies to the stars. He once claimed that the best perfumers were not just skilled with scent, but could sing a bloom open with their voice alone, that the greatest masters never touched the petals, only hummed over them until they gave up their fragrance willingly. It sounds absurd, of course, charming but absurd, and yet, as your own voice fills the courtyard in a low, tuneless hum, you wonder if, maybe, just maybe, there's some truth to it. Historians still argue whether the ancient Egyptians truly understood the emotional power of scent, or if they simply associated fragrance with cleanliness, with ritual, with order, which was so central to their worldview that even perfume had to play its role in the cosmic balance. But then again, when you smell this rich, petal-drenched oil, sweet and soft and layered, like the folds of a priestess's robe, now you find it difficult to believe they didn't understand exactly what they were creating. You think about how perfume was used in temples and tombs, on bodies and on statues, in daily life and death alike, and how something so delicate could be so constant. As though smell were the one sense that refused to forget. even when sight faded and memory crumbled. You add the new mash to the previously filtered oil, mixing gently, respectfully, folding one layer into the other until the amphora is warm with scent, almost vibrating with it. Then you set it aside again, cover it, wait. And while you wait, you begin preparing something else entirely. The stoneware pots that will one day hold the final product, each one shaped by hand, baked in a slow fire, cooled under sand, and polished with river stones until smooth enough to reflect a ghost of your face. The pots are small, meant to be held in the palm, nestled into the folds of a linen sleeve, or tucked discreetly into a sash. You paint a few with symbols, not words, just images. A blooming lotus, a ripple of water, a sunburst, each one a kind of secret code that tells you what's inside, without ever needing to say it out loud. You remember the first time you held a finished jar in your hands, the clay warm from the sun, the wax seal unbroken, the scent hidden within like a sleeping creature. You were a child then, too young to be trusted with real oils. But your mother let you open it anyway. Just once, just for a second. The smell that poured out made your knees go weak. Not because it was powerful, but because it was complete. It didn't smell like a flower, or a river, or a courtyard, or even the earth. It smelled like all of them, folded together, softened by time, sharpened by memory, and carried on the air like a whisper from someone who loved you a very long time ago. Now, years later, you are the one sealing jars, grinding petals, layering scent upon scent in the hope that someone, someday, will unstopper a bottle and feel exactly that. The sun begins to lean westward, casting long shadows across the courtyard, and the cat has moved again, this time to the top of a storage jar, where it watches you with one half-closed eye and the disinterested expression of a creature who knows it will outlive you all. You take one last look at the amphora, now resting peacefully in the shade, and smile. The fragrance has deepened again, its edges smoother, its heart fuller, and you know without checking that tomorrow it will be better still. And so the day ends, not with fanfare, not with triumph, but with the soft clink of tools being put away, with the hush of linen covers being adjusted just so, and with the quiet certainty that you have done something good, something real, something beautiful in its small, persistent way. Because to make perfume from lotus flowers is not just to bottle a smell. It is to bottle a moment, a place, a breath, a heartbeat, a fragment of time suspended in oil and memory. And that, you think, as the sky turns amber and the first stars blink open above the reeds, is something worth doing. The next phase in your slow and scent-soaked routine begins, as always, with the rising of the sun and the quiet hum of expectation that comes with knowing that today you'll move from the tender intimacy of petals to the warmer, heavier world of oils and animal fat, where the fragrance no longer floats delicately in the air like a whispered thought, but settles deeper, thicker, more enduring, almost stubborn in its determination to cling to skin, to cloth, to memory itself. You've already filtered the first infusion, folded the fresh mash into its golden bath. And now, as the courtyard begins to fill with light and the shadows shrink against the walls, you set your attention on preparing the medium that will make this scent last. Not for hours, not even for days, but for weeks or even years, if sealed properly and kept out of reach from greedy little hands and the relentless sun. The truth is, lotus essence by itself is fleeting, a shy spirit that evaporates as soon as it's noticed. The kind of fragrance that dances at the edge of your awareness and then disappears the moment you try to follow it. Which is why the Egyptians, being both practical and poetic, turned to oil and fat, not as mere carriers, but as guardians, protectors of the ephemeral, willing to bind the ghost of a scent to something more solid, more real, more obedient to the will of time. The fat in question, goat fat to be precise, is not exactly glamorous when it first enters the scene. It arrives in a lumpy, pale state, wrapped in linen or clay, often smelling more like the animal it came from than anything you would want near your nose. But with patience, with heat, and with repeated cleansing, it transforms into something surprisingly neutral, a blank canvas waiting to be painted with invisible flowers. You begin by selecting the cleanest batch from your supply, carefully carved and stored after the last market day, and place it into a wide copper basin, already dulled from years of use, its surface lined with faint scratches like the rings of a tree. Beneath it, the coals are already glowing, fed by date palm fronds and small splintered logs that smoke only a little and smell faintly sweet, like burnt figs and river mud. You settle the pot atop the stones, adding the fat by the handful, feeling it squish slightly between your fingers, an unpleasant but necessary task. And then you wait, not impatiently, but attentively, as the heat begins its slow persuasion. There's a delicate art to rendering fat for perfume. Too hot, and it burns, taking the scent with it, turning everything acrid and bitter. Too cool, and it never truly melts, remaining stubbornly lumpy, resistant to infusion. But just right, just warm enough to coax it into a smooth, glistening pool. And it becomes the perfect base, ready to drink in the essence of whatever you choose to give it. You stir with a long-handled wooden paddle, gently scraping the sides, watching as the solid lumps soften, slide, and eventually surrender, transforming into a liquid so thick and gleaming it catches the sunlight like polished amber. You skim away the impurities as they rise to the surface, little bubbles of scum and bits of membrane, flicking them into a waiting bowl where they'll later be used for lamp grease or traded for coarse soap by those less particular. As the fat simmers, you prepare the cloth filters, squares of clean linen boiled in salt water, rinsed, dried, and folded with almost religious precision. You place one over a wide-mouthed jar, and when the fat is ready, pour it through slowly, letting the cloth catch any last imperfections. What comes through is a smooth, viscous oil, pale gold and utterly bland. But that blandness is what you want. It is the blank silence into which you will whisper the voice of the lotus. You set the jar aside to cool slightly, and while it does, you revisit your fragrant mash, which has been steeping quietly overnight, its scent deepening, darkening, thickening into something more confident. This mash you now spoon into the fat, layering it gently, not all at once, allowing the mixture to settle before stirring, folding the perfume into the fat like a secret. Some perfumers add resin at this stage, myrrh or benzoin or a little bit of frankincense ground into powder. But you prefer the simplicity of the lotus, its solitude, its unwavering identity. And so you stir it in alone, letting the fat take on its scent slowly, like water taking on color from steeped tea. The mixture is then sealed tightly, reverently, and placed into the earth itself, into a small pit dug at the far end of the courtyard, shaded by a leaning date palm, where the temperature remains steady and cool. A natural cellar for those without the luxury of stone chambers. The jar will stay there for several days, sometimes longer, depending on how strong a scent you wish to create. And during that time, you'll check it occasionally, give it a gentle swirl, whisper to it even, if no one is around to hear you. Whether the whispering helps, you couldn't say, but it doesn't hurt either. And it does make you feel like a co-conspirator with the flower itself, as though you and the lotus are in this together. Historians still argue whether the ancient Egyptians infused their fats once or multiple times. Some say they repeated the process over and over, replacing the spent petals with fresh ones day after day, layering scent upon scent like pigment on a wall painting, while others insist a single infusion, if done properly, was enough. You, for your part, belong to the school of excess. You believe that the gods notice effort, that the spirits of the dead appreciate extravagance, and that no noblewoman ever complained her perfume was too fragrant. So you repeat the process again and again. Each new batch of petals added to the same fat, stirred gently, cooled and reburied, until the mixture is so saturated that even a single drop, warmed by skin, seems to release a miniature sunrise into the air. As the days pass, your hands grow fragrant. No matter how many times you wash them, the scent clings to your skin, seeps into your nails, even seems to settle in your hair and on your clothes, until you begin to smell like a walking garden yourself. A side effect that earns you many approving nods and the occasional jealous glance from others in the marketplace. The one elderly scribe did once accuse you of trying to seduce a donkey, which you chose to interpret as a compliment about your technique, rather than a commentary on your social life. Eventually, the fat is ready, or as ready as it ever will be, and you begin the final filtering, passing it through even finer linen this time, squeezing the cloth gently to coax out every last drop, until the jar is full of a golden, thickened oil that glows faintly even in shadow, its scent unmistakable. Lotus and nothing else. Not flowers and honey and river water. Not almonds and clay and sunlight. Just lotus, pure and complete, as though you've somehow managed to distill the very idea of the flower into something that can be held, bottled, gifted, or sold. You pour it into small alabaster jars. Their pale surfaces cool to the touch and slightly translucent, as though carved from moonlight. Each one is sealed with a plug of beeswax and linen, then tied with twine soaked in rosewater to keep insects at bay. You place them carefully on a woven tray, their contents warm even through the stone, and carry them to the shade, where they'll rest until needed, whether for temple offerings, noble banquets, burial rites, or simply to anoint the wrists of someone hoping to be remembered for just a little longer than usual. The courtyard is quiet now, filled with the heavy scent of completed work. And as you sit back, Your hands oily, your arms tired. You feel a strange and pleasant weight in your chest. Not fatigue exactly, but the settling of satisfaction. The knowledge that you've done something that will outlast the day, perhaps even the week, maybe more. Because perfume, unlike bread or ink or fabric, isn't meant to be seen or touched or consumed. It's meant to be carried by wind, by memory, by skin, and sometimes, just sometimes, by the gods themselves. The next stage of the process requires fire. Not the wild, crackling kind that devours wood in a feast of flames and smoke, but the slow, controlled heat of a small brazier, tended carefully by someone who knows how to coax a gentle simmer without boiling the life out of everything nearby. A kind of fire that hums rather than roars, that waits patiently for instructions rather than demanding attention, with sparks and ash. It is near such a brazier that you now sit, cross-legged on the cool tile floor of your workshop, surrounded by tools of both alchemy and kitchen. Because in ancient Egypt, there was often little difference between a perfumer and a cook, a fact that still amuses you every time someone confuses a pot of infused oil for soup and nearly dips bread into it. Before you, arranged in a semicircle like sacred relics of a scent-obsessed priesthood, are your copper vessels, some wide and shallow, others tall and narrow, each designed with a slightly different purpose in mind, though all united by their ability to carry heat in just the right way. There is one pot, however, that you reach for with particular care. A small, thick-bottomed cauldron, dented in one corner, its handles worn smooth by decades of lifting and pouring, its interior darkened not with dirt, but with the patina of 1,000 fragrant mixtures, each new blend adding another invisible layer to its memory. It is this pot that you use for distillation, not because it is the most efficient or even the cleanest, but because it has never betrayed you by overheating or cracking under pressure. And you suspect it knows more about perfume than you ever will. You begin by adding a ladleful of the fat-infused lotus oil, now thick and golden and deeply scented, to the pot, watching as it clings to the sides before settling into a slow, syrupy pool at the bottom. Into this, you add a splash of river water, cleaned by passing through a clay filter filled with sand and crushed date seeds, and a handful of freshly crushed lotus petals for good measure. Not because the recipe requires it, but because you believe the scent becomes more vivid when reminded of its origins, as though the oil needs to remember what it once was in order to become what it will be. Then you set the pot onto the brazier, adjusting the height of the supports so that it hovers just above the coals, not touching them directly, but close enough to feel their warmth begin to rise. The smell begins almost immediately. Not strong, not dramatic, but subtle, like a secret whispered in a quiet room. A scent that curls slowly out of the pot in a thin ribbon of steam, winding its way upward, tickling your nose, and disappearing before you can quite catch it. You place a shallow, domed lid over the pot, its underside coated with a thin film of beeswax, which, when cooled, will trap the vapors as they condense, allowing you to scrape them off later with the edge of a copper spatula, and add the resulting paste, a concentrated essence, to your final product. This process, simple in theory, requires endless patience, as the steam must rise slowly, condense gradually, and cool without interruption, lest the scent escape into the air and be lost to the desert winds. While you wait, you busy yourself with cleaning and preparation, wiping down the work table with damp linen, sorting jars by size and purpose, and checking your supply of additives. Things like crushed pine resin, rose petals, cinnamon bark, and dried myrrh. Though today you'll use none of them. Today is for purity, for Lotus, and only Lotus. Still, it comforts you to have them nearby. These dusty little bundles of scent and memory, tucked into baskets and small clay pots, each labeled with a crude symbol drawn in ochre. An eye for frankincense, a flame for cinnamon, a tear for myrrh. Each one a story waiting to be told in the language of scent. The brazier crackles softly, a tiny voice in the corner of the room, and you lift the lid of the pot just enough to peer inside, careful not to disrupt the condensation forming above. The oil bubbles slowly, releasing its fragrance in rhythmic sighs, and you smile, because this is the moment when perfume begins to feel like spell work, when every action, no matter how small, seems charged with meaning. You imagine the vapor curling into shapes, lotus blossoms, temple columns, the face of a god half hidden behind a fan of feathers. And you wonder, not for the first time, whether scent might be a kind of language that the gods themselves use when they don't feel like speaking out loud. Historians still debate whether distillation, as you know it, was fully practiced in ancient Egypt, or merely hinted at in fragments of text and half-decayed equipment unearthed from tombs and ruined workshops. Some claim the technique came later, imported from distant lands where alchemists experimented with glass coils and sealed chambers. Others insist that the Egyptians, ever ingenious and obsessed with beauty, must have discovered some version of it long before the rest of the world caught up. You, of course, don't particularly care what historians argue about. Your methods work, your oils sell, and your customers return, not because you follow a precise timeline of technological advancement, but because your perfumes linger longer than memories and leave behind a trail of whispers. After several hours, yes, hours, you gently lift the lid and use a small scraper to collect the sticky residue that has formed on the underside. A translucent, golden film that smells like concentrated sunlight and sacred gardens. This paste, carefully transferred into a tiny alabaster jar, will be blended with your base oils to add depth, complexity, and that elusive sparkle that makes a perfume feel alive. You only collect a tiny amount, barely enough to fill your fingernail. But even that is enough to transform a simple oil into something worth twice its weight in incense. You let the pot cool, stir the remaining mixture one last time, and pour it through a fine cloth into a storage vessel, watching as it gleams in the afternoon light, thick and glistening, like liquid gold flavored with heaven. You seal the jar with wax, press a stamped seal into the soft top. Your symbol, a stylized lotus surrounded by 3 dots, and set it aside to rest. There are still more steps to go, more layers to build. But this moment, this jar, this scent, it feels complete, even if only for a moment. And in this moment, you think about where this perfume will go. Not just physically, into a palace or a tomb or a temple, but emotionally, into someone's memory, into their skin and their story. Perhaps it will be dabbed behind the ears of a young noblewoman on the morning of her wedding, mixed with rose oil and nervous laughter. Perhaps it will be poured over linen strips as part of a sacred burial rite, carried into the afterlife with the dead as a sign of care and love and wealth. Or maybe, just maybe, it will be gifted to a traveler, carried across deserts and seas, passed hand to hand through markets and ships and inns, until one day, in a land where no one knows what a lotus is, someone opens the jar, breathes in the scent, and dreams of a river they've never seen. As the sun begins to slip behind the courtyard wall, casting long stripes of gold across the floor, you sit back and stretch your legs, hands oily, hair damp, eyes heavy with the slow rhythm of the day. The cat, who has taken up residence once more on the lid of your oil jar, opens one eye just long enough to acknowledge your effort, then returns to sleep with the smugness of one who knows they have chosen the coolest spot in the room. You let your head fall back against the wall and close your eyes, breathing in the thick, sweet air, letting it fill your lungs, your skin, your thoughts. You smell of lotus and fire and work, and that, you think, is enough for today. Morning returns with a familiar glow, but today it brings a new intention. One that is less about the raw mechanics of crushing petals and heating oils, and more about the delicate, uncertain art of improvisation. Because while the ancient world often appears to us as a place of rigid rituals and deeply prescribed traditions, the truth, at least as you live it, is far more fluid, far more dependent on what's available in the moment, what the market brought, what the weather allowed, and what your nose tells you when all the scrolls and recipes fall silent. Today you find yourself standing in the corner of a shaded courtyard, hands on hips, staring at 3 small ingredients that were never meant to meet each other, but now, somehow, must. Palm wine, honey, and a scattering of leftover lotus petals that are just on the verge of wilting, their edges beginning to curl inward, like shy children summoned to recite poetry in front of strangers. You didn't plan to use palm wine today. After all, it's not strictly traditional in perfumery, and you know at least 3 elders who would click their tongues in disapproval if they even suspected you were considering it. But when a merchant stumbles into your workshop before sunrise, offering a half jug of freshly fermented palm sap in exchange for a tiny bottle of your cheapest oil, you find yourself struck by the kind of idea that arrives only when you're half awake and surrounded by scent. What if, instead of using oil or fat as the base this time, you tried something different? Of course, you can't make perfume from wine alone. The alcohol would evaporate far too quickly in the heat, and the scent would vanish before it ever reached anyone's nose. But what if you mixed it with honey, thick and slow, to anchor the volatile notes, and then steep the entire blend with lotus petals in a sealed clay jar, buried for a week beneath cool sand? Would it smell good? Would it last? Would it rot horribly and attract every ant in the kingdom? Probably all of the above. But the thrill of not knowing, of testing the limits of fragrance and fermentation, is too tempting to resist. So you begin First by heating the honey over a low flame until it runs smooth and liquid. Not bubbling, just warm enough to pour. It smells sweet, of course, but also a little wild, earthy, floral, sticky with memory. And as it melts, it releases faint notes of whatever flowers the bees visited. Traces of tamarisk and clover, of desert blooms that no one ever sees, but somehow make their way into everything. You pour the warm honey into a mixing bowl, then strain the palm wine into it, careful to catch any sediment, and stir slowly until the two swirl together in a golden spiral, one thick, one thin, but gradually forming a syrup that seems heavier than it should be, as though it knows it's being asked to carry something sacred. You add the lotus petals next, gently folding them into the mixture with a wooden spoon, careful not to crush them this time. Because this method, if it works, will rely more on infusion than extraction, on coaxing the scent gently from the petals rather than smashing it out of them like juice from a fig. The petals float briefly, then begin to soften, sinking slowly into the syrup until they disappear, leaving only a faint pink hue that spreads across the surface like a blush on someone trying not to be noticed. You pause, take a deep breath, and find that the scent is already beginning to shift. Faintly sweet, vaguely fermented, with a floral undercurrent that feels more like suggestion than reality. The kind of smell that you can't quite describe but would recognize instantly if it brushed past you in a crowded market. Historians still argue whether ingredients like honey and palm wine were ever really used in ancient perfumes, or whether such combinations were more medicinal, more culinary, or purely ceremonial, added not for scent, but for symbolism. Some claim that wine was poured onto temple floors during rituals, that honey was offered to the gods as sustenance, that perfumed syrups were used as early cosmetics, or even early mouthwashes, though no one can say for certain what was done intentionally and what simply happened because someone was curious or desperate or had spilled something interesting into something else. You, for your part, lean toward the theory that curiosity was a more powerful force in the ancient world than anyone wants to admit, and that much of what we now consider traditional started life as an accident with surprisingly good results. With your strange new mixture complete, you pour it carefully into a small clay jar, one without glaze, so that the porous surface can help regulate moisture and keep the mixture from turning sour. You seal it with a cork made from palm pith and melted wax, then bury it in the shaded corner of your courtyard, beneath the fig tree where the soil is cool and damp and humming with subterranean activity. You mark the spot with a small carved stone, a lotus blossom surrounded by 3 lines, and leave it there, not expecting much, but hoping for magic. With that experiment tucked safely away, you turn your attention to another, more conventional task: preparing a batch of perfume for a temple ceremony scheduled at the end of the week. An offering for the goddess Hathor, who, among many other things, is considered the patron of music, joy, fertility, and, most relevant to your work, beauty and fragrance. The priests have requested a blend that includes blue lotus, frankincense, and a small pinch of ground cinnamon. An unusual combination, but one that, when balanced correctly, creates a scent that is both grounding and uplifting, floral and spicy, like incense wrapped in silk. You retrieve your best lotus oil, rich and golden, then warm it gently before adding powdered frankincense, letting it dissolve slowly into the fat, releasing a resinous, citrusy aroma that deepens as it mixes. The cinnamon, added last, brings a sharpness that cuts through the sweetness, sharpening the whole composition into something bright and commanding, the kind of scent that doesn't just linger in a room, but takes ownership of it. As you stir the blend, you imagine the temple ceremony to come, the chanting, the swaying, the clatter of sistrums, the rising smoke, and the statue of the goddess bathed in candlelight, her painted eyes reflecting the fire. Her stone face, Serena's perfume, is poured over her feet and into the sacred brazier. Once the mixture is complete, you pour it into a long-necked alabaster vessel, its interior lined with beeswax to prevent absorption, and seal it tightly, wrapping the neck with linen and tying it with a cord dyed red, the color of life and protection. You place it in a reed basket alongside other offerings: dates, pomegranates, a small jar of milk, and set the basket near the door, ready for the temple assistant to collect in the morning. Then, with that done, you sit down beneath the fig tree with a cup of cool barley water and let yourself exhale. There is something deeply satisfying about finishing a batch, meant not for sale, not for seduction or ceremony of the living, but for the divine. Something that requires no praise, no approval, something you do not because someone asked, but because it feels right, because it connects you to something older and larger than yourself. Something that doesn't care if the perfume is perfect, only that it was made with intention. The sky begins to soften, fading from bright blue to dusty gold, and the shadows of the fig tree stretch across the courtyard like gentle arms. You sip your drink, listening to the buzz of insects and the occasional hoot of a sleepy owl who apparently hasn't realized it's not nighttime yet, and you smile. Somewhere beneath your feet, a jar of honey and wine and flour waits to become something new. Somewhere across the city, a priest polishes a statue in preparation for a ceremony he has performed 100 times. Somewhere on the breeze, a faint scent of lotus clings to the air, drifting past the walls and into the streets, where it brushes the skin of a passerby who pauses, inhales, and for a brief, unexplainable moment, feels better. And you, sticky with honey, faintly tipsy from fumes and tired in the best possible way, feel the same. By the time the temple assistant arrives, barefoot, serious-faced, and far too young to be trusted with anything fragile, you've already rechecked the wrapping on the alabaster vessel 3 times, adjusted the position of the linen in the reed basket, and sprinkled a few extra drops of lotus oil onto a slip of cloth, tucked carefully between the pomegranates. Not because anyone told you to, but because you believe that something as sacred as a perfume offering should arrive not only whole, but in full bloom, as if the scent itself had been gently awakening during the journey, and would reach its peak at the precise moment it touches the goddess's feet. You hand the basket over with a smile and a brief warning about tilting it sideways, but the boy nods solemnly and disappears into the dust with the precious cargo, leaving behind a faint trail of sweet air that lingers a little too long in the doorway, like a guest reluctant to leave. With the offering gone, You turn back toward your workshop, and for a moment, you allow yourself the dangerous luxury of believing that the day's work is done. But you're reminded otherwise almost immediately by the arrival of your neighbor, who slips through the doorway without knocking. Because why would anyone knock? It's just Perfume after all. And proceeds to regale you with news of a banquet being hosted tomorrow evening by a minor noblewoman who, apparently, has recently decided that she will not wear anything on her body that hasn't been blessed, stitched, or scented by someone personally acquainted with the goddess Hathor. The neighbor, a retired linen dyer, with a fondness for wine and gossip, is not particularly invested in perfume as an art form, but is very invested in being invited to banquets. And as such, she has taken it upon herself to volunteer your services to the noblewoman's steward without asking, which means that you now have less than a day to prepare a custom fragrance that meets the unusually vague specification of something that smells like a festival, but also a prayer. You groan, but only internally, because you understand the opportunity. This noblewoman, though minor, is known for her influence among the city's merchant elite, and a well-received perfume could mean more commissions, more trade, more jars traveling to more corners of the region, carrying your scent into rooms you will never enter. So you thank your neighbor through gritted teeth, send her off with a sample bottle she didn't ask for, and begin to think, not just about which ingredients to use, but about the woman herself, or at least the image of her you've constructed from fragments of stories. Young perhaps, or older, but wishing to appear younger, wealthy enough to afford scented oil, but not so wealthy as to own a private apothecary, deeply invested in appearances, but also someone who wants to feel as though her perfume is more than vanity, that it connects her to something higher, older, divine. You sit beneath the fig tree, letting the weight of the request settle into your bones, and begin to sketch the scent in your mind. It should open with something bright, celebratory. A first impression that speaks of joy and sunlight, and the shimmer of gold-threaded linen. Then a middle note that grounds it, makes it familiar, comforting, something warm and human like cinnamon or myrrh. And finally, a finish that floats, that whispers rather than declares, a breath of something floral and sacred, a reminder of the temples, of prayers whispered into dawn air, of gods who might still be listening. You begin by assembling your ingredients, choosing with care and deliberation. Crushed citrus peel from the last shipment of bitter oranges, brought from the delta and sun-dried, until it smells like concentrated joy. A stick of cinnamon bark, shaved into fine curls with a bronze blade. A scrap of resinous frankincense that crumbles into your fingers, its scent sharp and clean like the inside of a sacred space. And, of course, lotus oil, your own from your freshest batch, still rich with the memory of the river. To this, you consider adding a few dried rose petals, not for their scent, which is faint, but for their symbolism. Because roses, even when wilted, still carry a kind of elegance that people recognize without understanding why. You heat the base oil first, sweet almond again, because it fades beautifully into the background, and begin layering in your ingredients, stirring slowly, watching the colors swirl and shift like clouds in a mirrored sky. The citrus brightens the entire blend, lifting it instantly, while the cinnamon grounds it, pulling it back toward the earth. The frankincense crackles as it dissolves, releasing a note that feels like clean stone and distant thunder. And the lotus seeps in quietly, not demanding attention, but refusing to be ignored, threading its way through the other scents until everything feels woven together, inseparable. Once the blend has cooled, you test it on your wrist, dabbing a single drop and waiting. The first burst is sunlight, citrus and warmth. Then the spice creeps in, soft and almost edible, followed by that late, lingering floral sigh that makes you close your eyes involuntarily, as if your body knows something sacred has passed near. It's not perfect, nothing ever is, but it's close enough that you feel a small thrill in your chest, a tiny ripple of pride that spreads out through your limbs, like warmth from a cup of hot tea. You pour the finished oil into a jar of pale pink clay, its surface etched with a simple sunburst motif, and seal it with a cork wrapped in red linen thread. Then you wrap the entire thing in soft cloth, tuck it into a reed basket alongside a polished mirror and a comb carved from horn, and write a short note on papyrus with a reed pen dipped in black ink. For the lady's joy and her memory both. May your scent walk before you and linger after. You're not a poet, but the gesture matters. And sometimes people need to believe that their perfume was made not just with skill, but with understanding. The basket is delivered that same evening, carried by your apprentice, a bright, skinny girl, who only recently stopped asking whether resin was edible. And when she returns, she is breathless and flushed, and carrying a folded scrap of linen that smells faintly of wine and perfume and importance. She loved it, the girl says, eyes wide. She opened it in front of everyone. She said she could smell the temple in it. And then she laughed and called it Festival for the Gods. You smile, nod, thank your apprentice, and send her off to wash up before dinner. But once she's gone, you let yourself breathe out slowly and deeply, feeling the tension in your shoulders release, feeling the day finally come to a close. There is still more to do. There always is. But for now, you are content to sit in the last light of the day, surrounded by the soft clink of cooling jars and the lingering scent of a perfume that may, if you're lucky, be remembered tomorrow. And if not, well, at least the fig tree is blooming again, and the air smells of something sweet, and your hands, though tired, still carry the faint, warm trace of a flower that once floated on the Nile. It's early again, but the kind of early that hums with stillness. The hour when the dust hasn't yet been kicked up by footsteps, and the only sounds are the low cooing of doves nesting in the rafters, and the faint rustle of palm fronds leaning toward the light. And you, already awake and dressed in your work tunic with its oil stains and frayed hem, are preparing not for a noblewoman or a temple or even a banquet, but for something older, quieter, and more enduring. The dead. Because while the world of the living is full of fragrant distractions, markets and festivals and flirtations and favors. It is in the tombs, in the slow, sacred work of embalming and preparing for eternity, that perfume reveals its most solemn and unshakable purpose. You're not a priest, not a full-time embalmer either, but you've worked alongside them long enough to know the rhythm, the order, the heavy silence of the preparation chamber, where time seems to move differently, and every gesture carries the weight of ritual. You gather your tools methodically, the vessels of oil, each marked with symbols, so no mistake is made. The tiny alabaster jars for face and hands, the rolls of linen strips that will be perfumed, dried, and then wound carefully around the body like the petals of a flower that must never bloom again. And always, always, the lotus oil, the centerpiece of the process, not just because of its scent, but because of what it represents: renewal, purity, a return to light after darkness, a promise that even in death, the body is not forgotten. You arrive at the preparation house just after sunrise, when the shadows are long and the air still smells faintly of last night's incense. And the priests greet you with the kind of nods reserved for those who are neither part of the clergy nor truly outside it. A quiet acknowledgement that your hands, though not holy, are nonetheless trusted to perform something close to sacred. The body lies already on the stone slab, covered modestly with linen, and as you approach, you catch the sharp tang of natron, the preserving salt that has dried the flesh and drawn out every last trace of moisture, leaving behind a form that is brittle, shrunken, and yet strangely dignified, as if, in being emptied of life, it has been filled with meaning. Your role begins, not with contact, but with scent. You unstopper the jar of lotus oil and hold it for a moment beneath your nose, breathing in the now familiar blend of river flower and resinous memory, letting it settle over your senses until the chamber feels slightly less silent and slightly more alive. You anoint the forehead first, just a drop, warmed between your fingers, and then the chest, the wrists, the soles of the feet, moving with slow precision, your movements echoing those of the priest who follows behind with prayer and chant, his voice low and steady, a kind of verbal weaving meant to bind the soul gently back to the divine. Then come the wrappings, layers upon layers of linen, each strip soaked in scented oil or resin, each pass of the cloth another thread in the tapestry of eternity. You dip your hands into a bowl of warmed oil and smooth it along the cloth before pressing it against the skin, winding it slowly, overlapping with care, always keeping the tension firm but not too tight, as though you were wrapping a beloved child against the cold. The smell grows richer with each layer, until the room itself seems to pulse with fragrance. The scent so dense, it becomes a kind of atmosphere, something you walk through rather than inhale, something that clings to your hair and your clothes and even your thoughts. Historians still argue whether these perfumes were meant only to preserve the body, or to please the gods, or perhaps to comfort the soul on its journey. A kind of olfactory breadcrumb trail leading through the darkness toward the field of reeds. Some scholars claim the lotus oil was symbolic, representing the daily rebirth of the sun, while others suggest it was simply the finest scent available, chosen for its ability to mask the smell of death and decay. But as you stand here now, hands slick with oil and linen unraveling at your feet like scrolls of ancient poetry, it feels less like an academic question and more like a truth so old it no longer needs to be explained. The dead are not forgotten, not abandoned, not left to dust and silence. They are embraced, perfumed, remembered. When the body is fully wrapped, you help place it into the painted coffin. The wood cool and smooth beneath your fingers. The painted eyes watching you with calm detachment, as if noting your technique. The coffin is sealed, lifted, and carried toward the waiting tomb, where the air is dry and close and smells of stone and long-kept secrets. You follow at a respectful distance, not part of the procession, but not entirely separate from it either, walking behind the priests and mourners as they murmur final prayers, sprinkle incense, pour milk and wine into shallow bowls, and press amulets into linen folds with fingers that tremble slightly, despite years of practice. At the tomb's threshold, you pause, as tradition demands, and leave behind one final jar, a gift, an offering, a message in scent that will last longer than any spoken word. The jar is placed beside others: honey, beer, dried figs, carved combs, little stone animals meant to come alive in the next world. You crouch briefly, fingers brushing the cool stone floor, and whisper your own farewell. Not loud, not elaborate, just a breath, and a name and a silent wish that the perfume you made will guide the soul safely, sweetly, forever forward. You return home tired, not physically. Your work is careful and deliberate, not strenuous, but emotionally hollowed out in that specific way that comes from brushing against the veil between worlds. You wash your hands in a bowl of rose water, letting the last of the oil slide off your skin, and sit beneath the fig tree with your eyes closed, letting the sunlight filter through the leaves in a dappled pattern across your face, breathing in the simpler sense of earth and bark and drying linen. You think about how scent is the last thing to fade, how even in sealed tombs thousands of years old, archaeologists have opened jars to find a whisper of perfume still inside, still trying to speak. And you wonder, if someone opened your jar 1,000 years from now, what would it say? Would it speak of the Nile, of fig trees and morning fires, of laughter and labor and prayers murmured into the folds of cloth? Would it smell like memory or like mystery? Would it still be beautiful? The cat, because of course there's always a cat, jumps onto your lap, kneads your knee with unsheathed claws, and then curls up as if you've been sitting there for years, as if the perfume of your skin has finally matured enough to make you worth lying on. You stroke its back absently and allow your thoughts to drift, carried by the lingering scent on your sleeves, on your palms, in your hair. Because perfume, you realize, is not about making something smell good. It's about anchoring something fragile to something lasting. It's about holding time still. It's about not forgetting. There's something oddly comforting about the rustle of papyrus scrolls in the early morning, especially when it's accompanied by the dry, musty smell of old ink and the faint scent of crushed lotus oil that seems to linger in the air like a ghost. You're not quite sure is friendly, but have grown used to all the same. And as you kneel down before the narrowed chest, where the scrolls are kept, each one rolled tightly, tied with faded linen and marked with symbols that only make sense if you've spent years squinting at them in poor light. You can already feel the slight flutter of anticipation building in your chest, because today you're looking for a particular recipe, one you haven't read in years, one passed down from a perfumer who worked in the service of Queen Tia, wife of Amenhotep III, and who, if the legends are to be believed, once created a perfume so powerful it made even the gods pause and inhale. You remember the story only vaguely. Something about the scent being prepared under moonlight, in complete silence, using ingredients harvested from the palace garden and blessed by 3 separate priests. But whether that's true or just a sweet-smelling exaggeration isn't really your concern right now, because what you're after is the formula itself, or at least a clue, a list, a fragment of forgotten wisdom that might give you something new to try, something unusual, something no one else is offering in the Perfume Quarter this week. The scroll you eventually find is disappointingly small, curled tight and slightly warped from moisture. And when you finally ease it open, carefully flattening its edges with a warm stone to keep it from curling back up like a disobedient leaf, you discover that most of the writing is faded beyond recognition, save for a handful of words scattered like puzzle pieces across the brittle surface. Blue lotus, beeswax, pounded cedar, date syrup, sifted ash. It's not much, not enough to reconstruct a full recipe, certainly not enough to guarantee success. But it's enough to spark something in your mind, a flicker of curiosity that quickly fans into the flame of experimentation. And you rise to your feet, scroll still open in one hand, and start planning before your sandals even touch the threshold of the workshop. You begin with what you have: blue lotus petals, carefully dried in the shade and stored in a sealed clay pot. A small block of beeswax, yellow and fragrant, and just beginning to crack along one edge. A bundle of cedar wood chips, imported weeks ago from the Levant, which smell dry and smoky and slightly spicy when rubbed between your fingers. And a jar of date syrup, so thick and dark it gleams like polished obsidian. The ash, well, that will come from your own fire, specifically from the charred remains of yesterday's batch of myrrh incense. Now nothing more than soft grey dust resting in the belly of your brazier. Still warm if you press your hand close. You work slowly, methodically, melting the beeswax over low heat in a wide bronze bowl until it softens into a golden pool, thick and glossy like sun-warmed honey, then stirring in the date syrup one drop at a time, watching as it folds into the wax in sluggish spirals, darkening the mixture and thickening it until it looks more like a balm than an oil. You crush the cedar chips into powder with your mortar, adding a pinch of ash and stirring them into the blend. And suddenly the scent changes, becoming less sweet, more grounded, as though the mixture has remembered that it came from trees and soil and fire, not just flowers and dreams. Finally, you add the blue lotus, not crushed or shredded, but whole, letting the dried petals soak and soften in the warm blend, their fragile bodies slowly absorbing the richness of the wax. their fragrance released gently over time. You stir the mixture with a long-handled spoon, careful not to break the petals, and pour it into a shallow dish to cool, where it settles into a soft, fragrant salve that gleams like polished amber and smells. How to describe it? Like dusk at the edge of a palace garden, just after the last harp string has been plucked, just before the lamps are lit, when everything is still and the scent of the flowers seems to hang heavier in the air, as though the night is inhaling. Historians still argue whether these recipe scrolls were strictly utilitarian or part of some deeper magical tradition, whether perfumers were merely artisans or also spellcasters in disguise, their formulas less about chemistry and more about intention, belief, divine favor. Some scrolls are maddeningly vague, filled with phrases like, "until the oil weeps," or "stir clockwise while the moon rises," which provide more poetry than instruction, while others are oddly specific in ways that seem almost superstitious. 12 drops of almond oil, not 11. Lotus petals gathered only on the 3rd day after flooding. Resins mixed while singing a hymn to Hathor in the minor scale. Whether these details were meant as precise instructions or simply the accumulation of centuries of trial and error wrapped in spiritual metaphor is impossible to say. But you, as always, treat them as both, as useful guides and as gentle invitations to listen to something older than logic. The balm is finished by afternoon, and you test it on your wrist, scooping a small smear with the back of your nail and pressing it into the skin. It melts on contact, spreading easily, leaving behind not just a scent, but a sensation. Soft, warm, steady, as if something invisible has settled on your skin and chosen to stay there. It's different from your oils, less volatile, more intimate, as though made not to impress a room, but to be carried in private, felt only by the wearer, and perhaps one very lucky companion standing very, very close. You pour the rest into small lidded pots made of alabaster and carved shell, each one lined with parchment to preserve the scent and labeled with a mark you invent on the spot. A lotus within a crescent moon. You don't plan to sell it, at least not yet. For now, it's an experiment, a memory made solid, a whisper from a dead queen's perfumer that you've tried your best to translate. And maybe, if someone opens one of these pots 100 years from now, they'll wonder who made it and why, and how they managed to bottle a moment that feels like dusk and music and the hush before something important. Evening comes, as it always does, soft and pink and slightly cooler than expected, and you sit beneath the fig tree once more, your hands stained with oil and ash and wax, your mind still buzzing with possibilities. The cat joins you, leaping into your lap with the kind of entitled grace that only cats possess, and you stroke its back, absently, while thinking of what to try next. Perhaps a blend of lotus and green barley, or a smoked rose oil pressed between cedar leaves, or even that peculiar idea you once dismissed. Sandalwood steeped in goat's milk and left to curdle beneath the stars, because perfume is never finished. Not really. Each scent is a conversation, a question, a memory in waiting. And as long as there are petals to crush, and oils to heat, and scrolls to decipher, you will keep listening, keep blending, keep stirring in silence and in song, chasing something that can never be caught, only invited to linger. By now you've learned that the world of ancient perfume, though built upon ritual, repetition, and carefully guarded technique, is not immune to rivalry, especially when it comes to the lotus flower, that fragrant floating emblem of rebirth and transcendence, whose role in your life has shifted from sacred symbol to daily substance. A bloom you've held between your fingers, so often it feels more like an old friend than a plant, though that friendship is frequently tested whenever you wander into the perfume quarter and overhear the sharp whispers and knowing glances exchanged between two very distinct camps of perfumers, each utterly convinced that only their lotus, the white or the blue, is the superior blossom for extracting a fragrance worthy of gods, queens, and discerning merchants, with more silver than sense. It begins innocently enough with a casual conversation near the dye stalls, where a neighbor asks if your latest batch was made with blue lotus. Her voice tilted just slightly with suspicion, and before you can answer, another voice chimes in, low, amused, and unmistakably sarcastic, insisting that blue lotus is little more than a muddy water weed with delusions of grandeur, and that true perfume, the kind that clings to silk and memory, comes only from the pristine, heavenly pure white lotus that opens its petals in dignified silence, while the blue one flops about like a drunk on festival day. The comment draws a few laughs, one or two snorts, and a prolonged sigh from a nearby incense vendor who has clearly heard this debate too many times and doesn't particularly care which flower wins, so long as they both keep him in business. You don't respond, not immediately, because you've heard the arguments before, in courtyards, marketplaces, even whispered between apprentice perfumers crouched over their stills like alchemists deciding the fate of civilization. On one side, the white lotus enthusiasts argue for clarity, for purity of scent, for that faint, airy sweetness that doesn't cling too hard to the nose, but lingers at the edge of perception, like a prayer half remembered or a song heard from the far side of a templed wall. On the other, the blue lotus loyalists, yourself included, though you try to keep it quiet, praise the flower's headier, more complex aroma, layered with that odd, dreamlike quality that feels less like smelling and more like feeling the perfume move through you, as if the flower has secrets and isn't afraid to share them. You head back to your workshop with the words still bouncing in your head, and despite your better judgment, you find yourself pulling both jars, one labeled blue, the other white, from the storage shelf and setting them side by side on the stone table, their wax seals still intact, the pale linen strips tied tightly around their necks to keep out the heat and the flies. For a moment, you just stare at them, feeling slightly foolish, but also a little curious, because it's been a while since you compared them directly. And now, with the afternoon light soft and warm and no urgent orders to fill, it seems as good a time as any to settle the matter for yourself. You unseal the white lotus jar first, easing the cork free with a slow twist, and the scent rises immediately. Light, almost translucent, a barely there sweetness that makes you think of clean linen, of dew on marble, of quiet mornings when nothing has yet gone wrong. It's the kind of perfume that soothes rather than seduces, that wears easily on the skin and doesn't demand attention. And you understand why temple priests favor it, Why mourners dab it onto burial wrappings. Why mothers press it onto the foreheads of sleeping children. It doesn't shout, but it holds. Then you open the blue lotus jar, and the difference is immediate. The scent is fuller, rounder, slightly bitter at first, but then sweetening as it settles. Like wine that's been left to breathe just long enough to remember it used to be grapes and sun and soil. There's something earthy beneath the floral note. Something that reminds you of wet stone, of firewood that's just begun to smolder, of distant music played on stringed instruments made from crocodile gut and polished ivory. It's heavier, yes, but not cloying. It wraps itself around you like a cloak, not a cloud. And for a moment, you understand why some priests won't touch it, claiming it stirs the senses too much for sacred rituals, that it calls to the body more than the spirit. Historians still argue whether the blue lotus used in ancient Egypt was truly the Nymphaea caerulea, which contains mild psychoactive compounds, or whether the term was used loosely, sometimes referring to entirely different species, or even symbolic representations rather than actual flowers. There are accounts of blue lotus being soaked in wine and shared at feasts, inducing a gentle euphoria, while other texts describe it as an offering to the gods, steeped in oil and burned in lamps that illuminated tomb walls and royal chambers alike. Some modern scholars claim its reputation has been exaggerated, that the effects are more myth than medicine, while others suggest that the very ambiguity is part of its power, that the blue lotus was never meant to be fully understood, only experienced as perfume, as vision, as dream. You dab each scent onto your wrists, close your eyes, and wait. The white remains soft, steady, familiar, like the memory of someone kind. The blue lingers longer, shifts more, dances at the edge of something you can't quite name, and you think, not for the first time, that maybe the real difference isn't in which scent is better, but in which story you want to tell. Because perfume, like all art, is as much about intention as it is about execution. And sometimes the same flower can say two completely different things, depending on when it was picked, who picked it, what the sky looked like that day, and whether the picker was in love, or angry, or grieving, or simply very tired and reaching for the bloom that was closest. You decide in the end to blend the two, not because you're trying to compromise, but because it feels right, because the tension between them, the airiness of the white and the density of the blue, might create something more interesting than either alone. You mix them carefully, drop by drop, adjusting the ratio as you go until the scent rising from the bowl feels like balance. Clean and mysterious, bright and deep. A kind of olfactory twilight that could belong to sunrise or sunset, depending on how you breathe it. You bottle the blend in a jar with no label, mark the bottom with a dot of red ink, and place it on the shelf among your other experiments, where it will rest until someone comes asking for something they can't quite describe. Something that smells like both river and fire, like silence and singing, like the moment before a story begins. Outside, the wind shifts. The smell of roasting garlic from a neighbor's courtyard creeps into the alley, mixing awkwardly with your more refined concoctions. And the cat, who has been napping with one paw over her nose, lifts her head, glares at you, and stalks off in protest. You laugh softly, stretch your arms and take one last deep breath of the blended Lotus, letting it fill your lungs and your thoughts and that small, quiet place behind your ribs where all your best ideas come from. Because maybe, just maybe, the point isn't to prove which flower wins. Maybe the point is to keep searching, keep sniffing, keep blending, keep trying, not to conquer fragrance, but to be in conversation with it, to ask it questions and see what answers it's willing to give. The river is low again, and the ferryman mutters about sandbars, about reeds growing where they never used to grow, about fish too lazy to swim and gods too silent to care. But none of that concerns you this morning as you crouch by the shore, a reed basket at your side and a short paddle in your hand, waiting for the man to finish his rant so you can load your amphorae and make the crossing before the sun climbs too high. Because today is a delivery day. And not just any delivery, but one to the southern docks at Thebes, where a small fleet of Perfume boats, yes, Perfume boats, is preparing to depart for Memphis, Elephantine, and even some settlements farther down the river, whose names change so frequently that the labels never seem to keep up. You've done this before? Many times, but the novelty never wears off entirely. There's something endlessly satisfying about watching jars you filled with your own hands be lifted onto narrow skiffs and tucked gently among crates of spices and bowls of linen, as if they were treasure, as if they mattered more than just the scent they hold, as if they carried a piece of your breath and care and patience across miles of river water to places you may never see, into rooms you'll never enter, onto the wrists and necks of strangers who will never know your name, only that the perfume they wear makes them feel, for a fleeting moment, more beautiful, more alive, more something. The ferryman finally waves you forward with a grunt, and you step into the low boat, careful not to jostle the reed basket as you set it down between your feet, watching the river slosh lazily against the hull, while dragonflies dart low over the surface, wings catching the light like chips of glass. The crossing is slow, not because the distance is great, but because the current plays tricks in this part of the Nile, pulling sideways without warning, and sometimes spinning the boat gently in place, which the ferryman claims is due to ancient whirlpools left behind by the tears of Isis, though you suspect it has more to do with hidden eddies and the uneven weight of cargo. Still, the journey gives you time to think, to breathe, to watch the shoreline drift past in slow, wobbly lines, papyrus stalks, half-submerged logs, the occasional heron standing motionless as a statue, and to imagine the days ahead for the jars at your feet, how they'll be offloaded in the docks, examined by merchants with squinting eyes and sunburned hands, bartered for with sacks of grain or trimmed wool or gleaming amulets that may or may not be genuine, and then carried into homes and temples and caravans where their scent will mingle with the sounds of strangers speaking languages you don't understand. Their syllables thick with salt and sun. By the time you reach the docks, the heat has grown heavy, pressing against your back like a thick, invisible hand, and the wooden planks underfoot radiate warmth as you step carefully onto the pier, balancing the basket and nodding your thanks to the ferryman, who mumbles something about crocodiles and paddles off without waiting for a response. The dogs are chaotic as always. Donkeys braying, children running, traders shouting in 3 different dialects while trying to outbid each other for bundles of dried fish and jugs of date wine. But you navigate the mess with practiced ease, weaving between carts and crates and clusters of linen-clad workers until you reach the section cordoned off for luxury goods. A rather generous term that includes everything from lapis jewelry to carved ivory to the honey-soaked pastries that melt into sugar if left in the sun for more than 10 minutes. Your shipment is modest. 5 sealed jars of lotus oil, 3 small pots of balm, and 2 experimental blends you've labeled with vague poetic titles in the hopes that mystery will increase their value. But it's enough to earn you a nod from the quartermaster, a sun-weathered woman with arms like rope and a voice that could probably carry across the river. Even on a windy day, she inspects each jar, sniffing delicately, making small noises of approval or dismissal, though her face remains unreadable as she scrolls notes onto a wooden tablet and hands you a token. Your proof of delivery, your key to payment, your fragile guarantee that your work won't disappear into the hold of a boat and be forgotten by all but the waves. As you watch your jars being loaded, gently, reverently, onto the narrow boats with their faded paint and patched sails, you feel a strange mix of pride and distance, as if part of you is going with them, packed between layers of linen and beeswax, sealed beneath a stopper of clay. These boats, slender as reeds and light enough to skim just above the water's surface, are built not for speed or strength, but for balance, for patience, for the long, slow journey downriver, where each bend brings a new village, a new port, a new set of noses, eager to inhale the essence of somewhere else. The scent you made, born in a shaded courtyard, nurtured over coals and stone, whispered into clay, is now a traveler, a migrant bloom drifting with the current. Historians still debate how perfumes were transported across ancient Egypt, whether they were guarded like treasure or treated like common trade goods, whether their recipes were copied and adapted along the way, or kept secret by loyal hands and sharp-tongued apprentices. Some believe that perfumers marked their jars with invisible codes, a fingerprint pressed into wax, a sequence of dots etched beneath the glaze, to protect their work from imitation, while others suggest that imitation itself was expected, even honored, a sign that your scent had value, that others found it worth stealing. You prefer to think of it less as theft and more as conversation, a dialogue between hands separated by time and distance, but joined by their desire to bottle something that cannot be held. You linger longer than necessary at the dock, watching the boats pull away, one by one, their sails snapping gently in the breeze, the water parting silently beneath their hulls. You imagine each vessel reaching its destination, the lids unsealed, the first drop poured into a shallow bowl or onto the palm of a curious buyer, the scent rising and spreading and filling the room with its quiet promise of memory, pleasure, longing. You wonder who will smell it, what they'll think, whether they'll guess at your name or your face or your hands, or whether the perfume will speak entirely for itself. A voice without a body, a gift without a sender. Eventually the sun grows too hot, and the bustle of the dock begins to fray your nerves. So you turn away and begin the walk home, cutting through narrow alleys where the shade is thicker and the air smells of charcoal and spice and the faint, acrid trace of dye boiling in heavy pots. The city around you is alive with movement, with sound, with purpose. But you carry a stillness inside you, a pocket of quiet shaped like a jar and filled with scent. And as you walk, you think not of sales or reputation or even profit, but of the scent itself, of how far it will travel, how long it will last, how many hearts it might reach before it fades into the air, forgotten, but not entirely gone, because that, in the end, is what perfume does. It moves without moving, travels without feet, speaks without language, remembers without being remembered. And you, for all your grinding and mixing and sealing, are just a small part of that motion, a link in the invisible chain of breath and blossom and time that connects one nose to another across years, across miles, across silence. Later that week, you find yourself once again elbow deep in the quieter chaos of the workshop. Though this time you're not boiling resins or balancing clay pots precariously on the lip of a brazier, but instead sitting cross-legged on the floor with a tray of wigs spread out before you. Yes, wigs, elaborate ones at that, made not only of tightly woven strips of human hair, but also of braided palm fiber and linen, adorned with beads, charms, and in at least one case, a little bronze falcon perched right where the temple meets the brow. And while you never really considered yourself a hairdresser, today you've been asked, or perhaps gently ordered, to prepare perfumes specifically for wigs. Because apparently there's a rising trend among the wealthier merchant wives to dab a little scented oil into the base of their headpieces, so that when they turn or lean in to speak, the fragrance wafts out subtly, like a whisper of status, a scented suggestion that they are refined, desirable, and perhaps just out of reach. You would have rolled your eyes at this request in your earlier days, when you still thought perfume should be serious, spiritual, reserved for temples and tombs and ceremonies beneath moonlight. But over time, you've learned that vanity, too, has its place in the world of scent, and that sometimes a woman placing a perfumed wig atop her carefully powdered scalp is engaging in her own form of worship, one where the gods are not carved from stone, but woven from attention and admiration, and the hushed envy of those seated beside her at a banquet. So here you are, gently parting the strands of one such wig, careful not to snap the older fibers, and dripping a tiny amount of a custom oil blend. Something light, sweet, slightly floral, along the woven base, letting it seep into the material before patting it dry with a cloth and moving on to the next. You've prepared 3 variations for today's order: one with blue lotus and rose, one with frankincense and orange peel, and one with an unusual blend of myrtle and coriander that somehow manages to smell like both springtime and serious intentions. The goal isn't to overpower, but to enchant, not to announce one's presence with a wave of fragrance, but to leave something behind when one exits the room. You learned early on that scent travels differently through wigs than through skin or cloth. Something about the oils binding with the coarser fibers. Something about heat rising from the scalp and activating the perfume slowly over hours. And you've had to adjust your mixtures accordingly, reducing the amount of fixatives, increasing the brightness of the top notes, and always testing each new recipe on that one unfortunate practice wig that lives in the corner of your shop and now smells like the inside of a spice jar after a sandstorm. As you work, the light in the workshop shifts, slanting in golden stripes through the lattice screen overhead. And you become aware of the stillness that has settled around you, a kind of gentle hush, broken only by the soft rustle of palm fiber and the occasional creak of the wooden stool, where the cat has chosen to observe your work with the same disapproving expression it wears for most of your decisions. You don't speak, and there's no need for music or prayer or distraction, because this, too, is sacred in its own way. This act of touching, tending, transforming, this moment where scent becomes not just a product, but a kind of story woven into strands, waiting to be read by anyone with a keen enough nose. Historians still argue over the social meanings of wigs in ancient Egypt, whether they were primarily decorative or hygienic, whether they indicated status or simply served as sun protection in a hot, dusty climate. But what they all seem to agree on is that scented wigs were more than fashion. They were identity. To perfume a wig was to declare something about yourself, that you cared, that you had the means to afford luxury, that you understood how scent could speak in places where words might fail. Some scholars believe certain wig styles were paired with specific fragrances, almost like a uniform. Temple priestesses with blue lotus, dancers with sweet almond and cardamom, widows with myrrh and cedar. Though most admit the evidence is fragmentary at best, pieced together from paintings, tomb artifacts, and the occasional scrap of papyrus that reads more like gossip than record. You think about this as you dab the final drops onto the last wig in the order, smoothing the strands gently with a warm hand, letting the heat coax the perfume into its resting state. And as you inhale, you're struck not just by the scent, but by the sensation of care. How much time, how much thought has gone into a detail so small that most will never notice it consciously, yet so potent that it may linger in memory long after a name has been forgotten. You wrap each wig in soft linen, tie them with colored thread, and place them into reed boxes lined with papyrus shavings, each sealed with a small wax stamp that bears your symbol, the open lotus flanked by tiny stars. Once the delivery apprentice collects the boxes and sets off down the street, his arms full, his steps quick, his nose already stained faintly with the mingled perfumes, you sit back on your stool, stretch your spine until it pops gently, and allow yourself a rare moment of idleness, sipping cool water from a ceramic cup and watching the dust float lazily through the shafts of late light. It occurs to you then how many lives your work touches, not just the obvious ones, the buyers, the wearers, the priests and merchants, but also the secondary, unnoticed ones. The washer, who cleans the linens, now perfumed with your oils. The servant who lights the lamps in a room, now filled with your scent. The child who brushes against a scented robe and wonders why the air feels suddenly sweeter. You remember faintly being that child once, too small to understand perfume, too curious not to notice it, sitting beneath a table during a family gathering, the adults' laughter rumbling overhead like distant thunder, and catching the scent of something beautiful wafting from a passing sleeve or an embrace, something you couldn't name but never forgot. Perhaps you think that's the real work of perfume. Not to be identified, but to be remembered. Not to shout, but to leave a trace. Even now you sometimes wonder if the scented wigs, the perfumed linens, the oil-drenched rituals are truly about appearance or pleasure at all. Or if beneath it all, what people are really chasing is presence, the desire to feel that they've left something behind, that their essence will linger even after they've gone, that the scent on the air will whisper, "I was here," long after their footsteps have faded. The sun dips low, throwing the workshop into deeper shade, and you begin the quiet process of cleaning your tools, wiping the jars, folding the cloths, brushing the last flecks of resin and hair from the work table. And as you move through these motions, you feel that pleasant exhaustion settle over you again. Not heavy, but earned. The kind of fatigue that smells faintly of success and beeswax and the distant memory of a flower pressed between the pages of a forgotten book. And just as you're placing the last cleaned jar onto the shelf, ready to close up for the evening, a small breeze slips through the open window, lifting a curl of linen, stirring the air, and carrying with it a faint mix of blue lotus, cinnamon, and something else. Something softer, perhaps from earlier, perhaps from a wig, perhaps from your own skin. And you realize, with a quiet sort of pride, that it's yours. This scent, this moment, this trace. You smile, not because anyone sees you, but because something in the air has answered back. It begins with a rumor, as so many things in your city do. Spoken too loudly at the dye market, overheard in fragments beside the fishmongers, whispered into the ear of a cloth merchant who promptly tells 3 others before noon. And by the time it reaches you, carried on the soft voice of an apprentice from a neighboring workshop who comes under the pretense of borrowing a spatula, but lingers with the giddy tension of someone bearing delicious news. The story has grown legs, arms, and perhaps a pair of jeweled sandals. Apparently, a fishmonger's wife, yes, that fishmonger's wife, the one with the loud laugh and the endless bracelets, has begun wearing perfume made from rejected petals and onion water, and it's catching on with alarming speed. At first you laugh, assuming the story has been twisted in the retelling or exaggerated beyond all recognition. But the apprentice swears it's true, that the woman, whose stall is tucked between 2 louder, smellier vendors in the open market, has been arriving each morning with a soft, sweet scent clinging to her garments, something unexpected and oddly pleasant, like crushed herbs and faded lily. And that other women, shoppers, servants, even the occasional priest's wife, have noticed and begun asking for it, even offering extra coins to find out where she got it, as if she stumbled upon a secret rather than a scent. You send the apprentice away with a politely confused smile and the spatula she didn't need. Then sit for a while in the shade of your courtyard, the stone beneath you, warm from the sun, the air heavy with your usual mix of almond oil and faintly spiced lotus. And you try to imagine what it must be like to make perfume out of what others throw away. To gather up bruised petals from the edge of the market. To boil them with sweet onion and perhaps a handful of thyme or fenugreek. And to discover, not by science or art, but by accident or necessity, something new, something strange. It gnaws at you gently, not like envy, but like curiosity left out in the sun too long. Because as much as you pride yourself on your training, your recipes, your control, you know that some of the most beautiful scents come not from mastery, but from mistakes. Batches gone wrong, jars forgotten in shadow, blends made under the wrong moon, or with the wrong bark, or stirred too many times. And that sometimes the best thing a perfumer can do is listen to what the ingredients are trying to say when they're not being asked to follow the rules. So the next morning, long before the sun has finished climbing the eastern wall of your neighbor's house, you wrap a cloth around your head, tie your tunic tight, and make your way to the market. Not through the usual entrance with its painted signs and overconfident vendors, but through the side alley near the potter's yard, where the ground stays cool and the early deliveries leave behind a trail of crushed herbs, broken reeds, and the occasional squashed fig. You move slowly, letting the scents guide you. Overripe melons, fresh mint, charred lentil cakes, wet hemp rope, until you reach the fishmonger's stall, where the woman stands with her sleeves rolled high, her hands deep in a basin of slippery silver fish, laughing at something her husband says, while expertly flinging a handful of salt over a bucket. And yes, the scent is there. Soft, clean, unexpected, hovering just above the sharper smell of fish and brine. Something green and warm and not unpleasant, like crushed scallion mingled with rain-soaked lily. You pretend to examine a basket of snails while inching closer, and when the woman turns to offer you a sample, her smile wide and genuine despite the sweat on her brow, you catch a fuller wave of the fragrance and realize with something like astonishment that yes, the rumor is true. There's onion in it, or at least the ghost of onion, softened and sweetened by something floral and sun-warmed, made palatable by contrast and daring. And before you can stop yourself, you ask her, softly, kindly, what she's wearing. She grins, wipes her hands on a rag, and tells you she makes it herself. Just old petals from the temple floor and a handful of wild green shoots from her garden, steeped overnight in warm water and strained through linen. Nothing fancy, nothing expensive, just something she started doing one day after her sister said she smelled like salt and vinegar. She doesn't seem to think it's strange or clever or revolutionary, just useful, just nice, just hers. You thank her, buy 3 fish you don't need, and walk home slowly, cradling the idea like a fresh egg. When you reach your workshop, you find yourself pulling out petals you had planned to discard. The wilted ones, the browned ones, the ones that smell more like damp paper than divine offering, and you toss them into a bowl without ceremony. Then you add a handful of spring onions, not the fat ones from the kitchen, but the wild, skinny kind that grow along the edge of the river, and a few stray herbs you'd forgotten you even had. Some chamomile, a pinch of dried fennel, and the last 2 strands of crushed rose from a jar you'd meant to throw out last week. You pour warm water over the mixture, stir it lazily with a spoon, and leave it in the courtyard to steep beneath a fig tree, covered with a square of cloth, weighted down by a chipped bowl. And for the rest of the day, you don't think about it. Not on purpose, not with intention, but it hovers in your mind like a question waiting for its verb. The next morning, you lift the cloth, expecting rot, expecting disappointment, and instead you find a soft, murky infusion that smells interesting. Not beautiful, not precise, not balanced in any textbook way, but complex, alive, oddly comforting, like something you've smelled before in a dream but could never name. You filter it gently through a piece of linen, bottle it in a simple glass vial, and set it aside, not for sale, not for display, but for testing. Your own skin, your own senses, your own quiet walks through the city, to see if anyone turns, sniffs, asks. Historians still debate how the lower classes of Egypt scented themselves, whether they used diluted versions of temple oils or made their own concoctions from garden scraps and river herbs, whether scent was a luxury or a necessity or a hidden form of rebellion. But you're beginning to suspect that some of the best perfumes in the world were never written down, never measured, never sold, only made and worn and passed quietly from hand to hand, from sister to neighbor, from market stall to back alley, like laughter or lullabies. By week's end, you've made 5 more batches, none of them exactly the same, none of them correct, but all of them curious, fragrant, stubborn in their refusal to fit into categories. And you keep them on a shelf apart from the others, labeled not with names, but with single words. Brave, chance, garden, edge, laughter. And when people come asking for something new, something they haven't smelled before, something real, you hand them one of these and say, "It's a little strange." And they always smile and reply, "Good." Because sometimes the best perfume isn't the one that reminds you of the gods. It's the one that reminds you of yourself. It happens quietly, as many important things do. Not with the clang of temple bells or the solemn procession of scribes in embroidered linen, but with a low drumbeat in the distance, followed by a flute that seems to be trying to sound cheerful, and a rhythm of footsteps that is just slightly out of sync. Because when people gather in masks, it is rarely for the purpose of perfect choreography. And as you step to the edge of the street, with your arms folded and your back pressed against the cool stone of your workshop wall, you realize that what has arrived today is not a parade, not a festival, not even a proper celebration with offerings and schedules and official blessings, but something far more unpredictable, more human, more wild, a motley procession of masked dancers, drummers, singers, and bystanders pouring down the avenue, in what seems to be a strange mixture of joy, satire, protest, and perfume. Because wherever there are masks, there is always scent. And wherever there is scent, there is the possibility of disguise. The crowd moves like smoke, curling around obstacles, growing at the edges, trailing laughter and shouts, and the occasional sarcastic hymn sung in a deliberately off-key voice. And you spot them among the revelers. A man with a jackal mask, dancing in slow, exaggerated movements. A woman with a painted falcon's beak, leading a chorus of chants that sound like the priestly incantations, but twisted into something slightly mocking. And children painted in stripes like cats, their faces smeared with oils, and their bare arms painted with hieroglyphs that make no grammatical sense, but carry the clear intention of mischief. What's most striking, though, isn't the color, or the noise, or even the dance, but the scent, the unmistakable blend of too much perfume on too many bodies, the overlapping trails of lotus, cinnamon, date syrup, sandalwood, and beneath all of it, a pungent, smoky note that you recognize instantly as burnt myrrh mixed with river clay. You've seen things like this before, usually during the high festivals, or in the weeks leading up to a royal birth or wedding, when people, too long held under the yoke of reverence and routine, suddenly erupt in a burst of noise and movement and theatrical irreverence, wearing masks not just of wood and paint, but of personality, of irony, of defiance, dressed up as celebration. And perfume, plays a central role in such moments, not merely to smell pleasant or to emulate the gods, but to shield, to exaggerate, to transform. For when a face is hidden and a scent is altered, who is to say what person remains underneath? A masked man stops in front of your shop and strikes a ridiculous pose, arms akimbo, chest puffed out, his painted face showing a grotesque parody of a well-known magistrate, complete with exaggerated nose and squinting eyes, and as he throws his head back and howls, the crowd laughs, not cruelly, but with that specific communal relief that comes from shared frustration finally given voice. He reaches into his tunic, pulls out a small clay jar, uncorks it dramatically, and smears something thick and shiny along the inside of his mask, then flings the scent into the air with a broad gesture that sends a wave of sharp floral bitterness your way. Crocodile grease, mixed with spoiled resin and probably garlic oil. A deliberately offensive concoction meant not to seduce, but to provoke, to punctuate the joke with a sensory punch. You're not surprised. In fact, you almost smile, because you've heard whispers of this. How certain rebels and mischief makers use perfume not to charm or console, but to weaponize identity, to mark their resistance not with swords or speeches, but with scent, crafting oils and pastes so pungent, so chaotic, that the very act of wearing them becomes a statement, and in some cases, a kind of protest. A way to turn the elite's obsession with elegance inside out, to make their sacred rituals smell just a little ridiculous. Historians still argue about the role of masks and perfume in public uprisings. Whether these displays were spontaneous acts of satire or carefully orchestrated performances meant to signal dissent without drawing swords. Whether the smells worn during these events were merely theatrical or actually symbolic, infused with layers of meaning, understood only by the initiated. Some scrolls speak of scent duels, in which opposing sides would arrive at a gathering wearing deliberately clashing perfumes, not to fight, but to overwhelm, to clash through the air, to make the very act of breathing a declaration of loyalty or opposition. Others mention court jesters who wore perfume so strong it gave headaches to dignitaries, or servants who secretly altered the scent of their mistress's wig to embarrass her during public ceremonies. But today, here in your street, under this late sun, and in the presence of dancers and drummers and gleeful chaos. It's not about theory or history. It's about now. You watch as the crowd swells, as more people join, some in masks, some without, some carrying bundles of herbs to burn, some with jars of flower water. They pour over one another's heads in mock blessings. And you feel that strange flutter in your chest again. That sensation you sometimes get when a new perfume is just beginning to take shape. When the ingredients have not yet merged, but are dancing close enough to imagine what they might become. Suddenly, someone grabs your wrist. A young girl, maybe 12, with coal-smeared eyes and a lion mask pushed up on her head like a crown, and she presses a small, wax-sealed jar into your hand with a grin before dashing back into the crowd, vanishing between a man in a goat mask and a dancer painted entirely blue. You glance down at the jar, fingers closing around it, and you know you shouldn't open it. Not here, not now, not without knowing what it contains. But of course you do, because you're a perfumer, and caution has never stopped curiosity from leaning in. The scent that greets you is odd. Not unpleasant exactly, but strange, like burned mint and overripe apricot and something almost metallic, like coppers warmed by the sun. It smells like something made in secret, something brewed in a clay pot behind a locked door, something that was never meant to be sold, but was always meant to be shared. You lift the jar to your nose again, breathing more deeply, and this time you catch it. A familiar base, something you've used before. Lotus, faint and bruised, almost lost beneath the other notes, but still there, still speaking. And suddenly it clicks. This isn't just perfume. This is message. This is a calling card. This is someone saying, we're here. We're laughing. We're masked. We're fragrant. And you cannot control what we smell like. You close the jar gently, place it on your shelf among the others, and say nothing to anyone about it. Not yet. But that night, after the noise has faded and the drummers have gone home and the paint has begun to flake from the masks discarded in alleyways, you light a small lamp, unstopper the jar again, and begin quietly to take notes. Not because you plan to sell it, not because you wish to replicate it, but because something in you respects the gesture. Because even in a world where scent is luxury, comfort, seduction, and prayer, it can also be rebellion. And that, you think, as the last of the day's heat slips from the stones beneath your feet, might be the most fragrant truth of all. The morning after the masked procession feels quieter than usual, not because the city itself has calmed. There are still shouting vendors, clanging pots, goats arguing with children, and the predictable cacophony of sandals slapping uneven stone. But because something in the air has shifted, an invisible aftertaste left by the swirl of perfume and song and satire, like the scent of incense that lingers long after the smoke has faded. And as you sit in your shaded courtyard, surrounded by cooling jars and bundles of fresh linen, you find yourself reaching for your tools with a kind of distracted slowness. Not out of laziness, but because your mind is still half caught in the echo of that day, still replaying the scents, the laughter, the sudden appearance of that strange masked girl, and the unexpected gift she placed in your hand. The jar she gave you, still sealed, still aromatic with that odd blend of bruised mint and warmed metal and faint, ghostly lotus, sits now on the edge of your table, untouched since last night, but it draws your gaze like a curious animal you're not quite sure is dangerous. And even though you have orders to fill, oils to stir, and a batch of balm to reheat before it turns into an unusable lump of scented wax, you keep looking at it, keep wondering what kind of mind would blend those particular ingredients, what purpose they intended, what message they tucked into that wax with such quiet confidence. You can't help it. You open it again, slowly, and this time you set the jar beneath your nose without rushing, letting the fragrance unfold in its own rhythm, and you begin to notice things you missed before. A dry edge of cinnamon bark, perhaps, or the crisp whisper of dried papyrus stalk. Something brittle and sun-worn, not strong enough to dominate the mixture, but present enough to add texture, like a well-placed wrinkle in otherwise smooth cloth. And then there it is, right at the end, almost too faint to notice. The barest suggestion of something resinous and expensive, possibly imported, possibly stolen, possibly added in such a small quantity that only someone obsessive or deeply intentional would include it. Galbanum, maybe, or a trace of opopanax, that bittersweet sap, harvested far from here and known to cling to skin like regret, sweet but heavy, beautiful but strange. You lean back in your chair and wonder if you've just discovered something revolutionary or merely strange. And either way, it's enough to pull you into experimentation again, the way a familiar melody pulls you into humming, even when you didn't mean to sing. You spend the rest of the day recreating, not copying, not exactly, but sketching a version of what you smelled, adjusting proportions, substituting where necessary, because you don't have everything they used, and perhaps wouldn't use it even if you did. Because your nose is your own, your story your own. And if you're going to work from someone else's strange scent, you're going to answer it, not echo it. You grind dried mint leaves with a touch of wormwood, add bruised coriander, a faint thread of cardamom, and just a breath of myrrh. Not enough to darken the base, but enough to keep it from floating too far upward. You steep this in warm moringa oil, which has a clean finish and a slightly grassy note that blends easily with green herbs. And as the mixture sits, infusing under the shade of the fig tree, you test small drops on linen, on skin, on clay, trying to track the way it evolves on different surfaces, how it clings, how it departs, how long it waits before revealing its heart. As the sun sinks and the oil deepens in color and complexity, you begin to realize what this perfume is meant for. Not seduction, not ceremony, not even rebellion in the most obvious sense, but intimacy, quiet transformation. The kind of scent that doesn't arrive with a flourish, but instead lives very close to the skin, close enough that only someone leaning in would notice it. And perhaps even then, they'd think they imagined it. It is a perfume for secrets, for confession, for letters not yet written and thoughts never spoken aloud. A perfume for two people standing very close together and pretending they're not. Historians don't always write about these kinds of perfumes. Most texts focus on the grand blends, The oils prepared for queens, the resins chosen for funerary rites, the precise mixtures used in temples to anoint idols and sanctify space. But there are hints, if you look closely, of more private sense. Short recipes written in margins, anonymous scrolls stored in private homes, notes exchanged between women in the palace, whispering about a new blend that smells like dreaming near fire, or like the skin behind a sleeping man's ear. These perfumes are not preserved in gold jars or buried in royal tombs. They're stored in memory, passed from hand to hand, and perhaps most often forgotten entirely, except for the trace they leave on linen long after the wearer has gone. You think about that as you finish bottling your new creation. Not in anything elaborate, just a small stone vessel with a wax stopper and no label, marked only with a finger smudge and a barely there carving of two wavy lines, like breath moving through water. And you set it aside, not for sale, but for study, for later, for when the right person walks through your door and says, "I don't want to be noticed. I want to be known." Just before night falls, a courier arrives, dusty and sweating, holding a scroll tied in deep purple ribbon, the kind only used by the palace staff or their favorite merchants, and you wipe your hands quickly, take the scroll with mild suspicion, and untie it with your thumb as the boy gulps down a bowl of cool barley water and promptly falls asleep against your doorframe. His task complete. The message is short, written in practiced, fluid script, and it is equal parts praise and request. Your recent blend, the one sent to the noblewoman with the scented wigs, has found favor in the court, and a guest of considerable stature wishes to commission a private perfume, one not for court presentation or festival finery, but for personal use. And the request is unusual. They want it to smell like night, not just any night. A Theban summer night, warm and slow and filled with sounds that don't wake you, only shift you closer to dreams. They want wind in papyrus reeds, stone that still remembers the day's heat, oil lamps burning faintly behind shuttered windows, the scent of distant figs ripening in darkness. And above all, they want it to feel quiet, not sleepy, not drowsy, but intimate. Still suspended, you exhale slowly, reread the scroll, and feel that familiar prickle at the base of your spine. The one that means challenge, the one that means you'll lose sleep over this, that you'll grind ingredients with half-closed eyes at dawn and mutter test results into your palm while walking through the market. But also the one that means joy, because this is the kind of perfume request you live for. Not a list of ingredients, not a comparison to someone else's blend, but a feeling, a request for a bottled memory, a moment that never quite existed, but somehow still lingers. You roll up the scroll, tie it again with the ribbon, and press it against your lips for luck. Then you turn to your shelves, your jars, your trays of bark and root and dried petal, and you begin to think. Not in recipes, but in metaphors, in textures, in silence and softness. In the precise moment when the heat lifts from the stones and the wind changes direction, because this, too, is perfume, not just scent, but atmosphere, not just chemistry, but poetry. and you are its translator, its servant, its sculptor, and the night is waiting. You begin not with scent, but with silence. The kind of heavy, generous silence that arrives only after the last torch has been snuffed, after the footsteps of servants fade down the corridor, after the city exhales beneath the weight of its own breath, leaving only the occasional flutter of linen against stone, the murmur of insects drawn to still warm thresholds, and the soft, stubborn memory of sun baked deep into the brick, refusing to surrender, even to the moon. Because when someone asks you to bottle night, they're not asking for darkness. Not really. They're asking for that delicate moment when the world doesn't sleep so much as wait, when everything is suspended, balanced between yesterday's warmth and tomorrow's promise. And if you're going to make a perfume that captures that pause, that hush, that late summer stillness, then you must first forget every loud and obvious note you've ever used, every golden oil that commands the air, and instead turn your attention to the soft-spoken, the easily overlooked, the ingredients that live close to the skin and speak in murmurs. So you close your shutters, draw your curtains, light a single lamp in the corner of your workshop, not to illuminate your hands, but to remind yourself of scale, of proportion, of how one small flame can warm a room if you're willing to be patient. And you begin to gather what you need, not quickly, not precisely, but with the slow deliberation of someone trying to remember a dream without waking it up. You start with crushed papyrus, not the kind meant for scrolls, but the coarser stalks soaked until they give off that faint aquatic musk, the scent of riverbanks at dusk, when the water is low and the frogs are louder than the priests. You pair it with a single pinch of dried fig sap, scraped from beneath the bark of a tree behind your cousin's house, which you collected 2 summers ago and stored in a pot labeled only Sweet Silence, because even then you knew it would be for something special. To this base you add crushed henna leaf, just enough to lend a ghost of green earthiness, like stepping barefoot into a garden where the plants have begun to wilt but haven't yet surrendered. And then a single shard of old sandalwood, aged and forgotten in the bottom of a cabinet, its edges dulled by time, but its heart still warm, still speaking. You hesitate before adding anything floral, because flowers, by their nature, are too awake, too morning bound. But you remember a particular blossom, the night-blooming jasmine that grows wild along the temple's outer wall, the one that waits until the priests are gone before opening, releasing its soft, honeyed sigh into the dark. And you add 3 petals, no more, crushed between your fingers and stirred in gently, as if not to startle them. You steep this mixture in sesame oil, neutral and clean, the kind used for anointing babies and smoothing calluses, the kind that disappears into skin without protest. And you place the jar beside your sleeping cat, who has curled herself around your mixing bowl, as if to guard it from unnecessary ambition. The oil will take hours, days perhaps, to draw out the subtleties you're after. And in the meantime, you experiment with smaller trials, single drop blends, breath-sized combinations tested on your wrist and behind your ears, each one a question whispered into the air, each one waiting for an answer. By the second night, you think you're close. There is a version that smells like old stone and wind, a combination of cedar dust and myrtle water that lingers just long enough to make your pulse slow. Another, made from soaked date seed and dried lotus root, gives off a faintly roasted sweetness, like memories carried in clay pots. But it isn't until the third trial, an unexpected pairing of black cumin and crushed blue lotus, bound together with a thread of honey, that you feel your breath catch. Not because it's beautiful, not because it's balanced, but because it smells like absence. Like the space between one footstep and the next. Like waiting. You bottle this one in glass, seal it with beeswax, and press a linen square over the top, tying it off with a strand of your own hair. Not for magic, not even for symbolism, but because it is yours. And this perfume is a secret, and secrets require some part of you to be given freely. You place the bottle inside a carved box, lined with old papyrus scraps, then wrap the whole thing in layers of linen soaked in cedar water, and send it off with a courier just before dawn, instructing him not to speak of it, not to linger, and not to sniff the box too deeply, unless he wants to dream of water for the next 3 days. As he disappears down the alley, you feel an unexpected wave of emptiness, as if something important has just left you. And you realize, again because you forget this every time, that making perfume is not unlike falling in love with someone who will never stay. You give and give and give, and in the end, all you're left with is the memory of the scent and the knowledge that it now lives on someone else's skin, far from your hands. But then something unexpected happens. The next day, a different messenger arrives. Not dusty and harried like the usual boys, but clean, quiet, and clearly of higher rank, carrying not a scroll, but a wrapped bundle, which he sets on your table without comment. Inside, you find an offering of gratitude, a length of imported linen dyed deep blue, a small pouch of silver flakes, and most surprising of all, a handwritten note, not in palace script, not from an official hand, but from someone else entirely. It simply reads, "At night, I remembered things I had forgotten to grieve. Your perfume made the silence kind." You sit for a long time with the note in your hand, and the workshop is still, even the cat silent, as if she too is reading. You think about how strange it is that scent, a thing so often treated as luxury, as decoration, can become a balm, a mirror, a kind of prayer whispered through the pores of the skin. You wonder who this person is, what grief they carry, what silence they needed to borrow, and you realize you'll probably never know. And that's all right, because perfume is not always meant to explain. Sometimes it is enough to hold, and in the cool shadow of your workshop, with the sun slipping slowly down the wall, and your fingers still stained with sandalwood and fig, you sit quietly and allow yourself, just for a moment, to feel the satisfaction of having made something invisible that mattered. You don't expect to find yourself in the desert again. Not so soon after crafting something so delicate, so quiet, so rooted in the shaded breath of night. But life, as you've come to accept, doesn't always respect the rhythms of your workshop or the slow ferment of your oils. And when your cousin barges in unannounced, sand on his sandals, urgency in his voice, and that particular glint in his eyes, that always means he's about to ask you for something both unreasonable and oddly poetic. You already know that you're going to say yes before he even gets to the part about the traveling caravan, the rare harvest, and the need for someone with a nose better than a falcon's and less temper than a royal guard, which is, of course, meant as a compliment, though you raise one eyebrow anyway, just to remind him that you've not yet entirely forgiven him for last year's beetle oil mishap. And so, 2 mornings later, long before the city stirs, you're wrapped in layers of linen, your jars carefully padded and strapped to your sides, riding a borrowed camel, whose gait is far more vertical than you'd prefer, as the rising sun paints long red fingers across the dunes, and the air begins to shift from cool whisper to warm breath to the dry, inevitable weight that will soon settle on your skin, like a second, uninvited garment. Your cousin chatters beside you about trade routes and dates and some minor feud between 2 spice dealers in Memphis that he swears could be resolved with the right blend of cedar and apology. But you mostly nod and let the wind fill your ears because your thoughts are elsewhere, drifting ahead toward the field of Lotus that waits for you on the edge of a desert oasis, where something rare, something deeply old, is said to be blooming. Not just any lotus, he assures you. This is wild desert lotus, smaller than its cousin in the river marshes, with petals more waxy than silken, and a scent that appears only at the precise moment before wilting. A scent so fleeting that most gatherers never notice it unless they're looking for something else entirely, like shade or a place to empty their sandals of grit. But someone, an old priestess, long retired and half forgotten, whose name your cousin cannot recall, once told him in passing that these lotuses, though fragile, hold within their brittle petals a perfume that smells not like life or water or freshness, but like memory itself. Dry, delicate, and full of things not said aloud. And of course, that's all you needed to hear. Because what is perfume really, if not the body of memory? By midday, you arrive at the edge of the oasis. Not the lush green haven you imagined, but a scraggly outpost of palms, brittle reeds, and a wide basin of cracked clay that still remembers water, though none has come in some time. And there they are, the lotus flowers, smaller than you expected, more like ghosts of their river cousins, pale ivory with edges already curled by the sun, their stems stubborn and low to the ground, almost apologetic in their posture. You dismount with a groan, stretch your legs, and kneel beside the nearest bloom, breathing carefully, not too close, not too fast, letting the scent come to you if it wishes. And for a long moment, nothing happens. But then there it is, not perfume in the traditional sense, not the bold announcement of rose or the sticky flirtation of myrrh, but a whisper, a trace, something dry and mineral and faintly bitter, like the smell of papyrus, warmed in the sun, or the breath of parchment, too old to read. It clings to the air for a second, maybe 2, then vanishes, as if embarrassed to have been noticed. You smile. This is going to be difficult. You gather carefully, using linen gloves and bronze shears, taking only the petals already beginning to fall, storing them in shaded clay pots with a handful of damp sand to keep them from crumbling. You work in silence, your cousin busy trading dates with a spice seller camped nearby. And the afternoon passes, in the kind of slow, hypnotic rhythm that only comes from repetitive work under a merciless sun. By the time the shadows stretch long and golden, you've collected enough petals for perhaps a single vial of extract. No more. And your back aches in that particular way that lets you know you'll smell like sunburned effort for days. Back at your tent, you begin the slow process of infusion. First cold pressing the petals with olive oil, not your usual choice, but better suited to the fragile dryness of the desert flowers, and then burying the sealed jar in a shallow pit lined with warm stones to mimic the way these petals themselves were formed. Not in water, but in heat and silence. As you wait, you sip tamarind water from a gourd and listen to the desert breathe. Yes, breathe. Because if you've lived here long enough, you begin to hear it. The sigh of cooling stone, the soft shuffle of dust as it repositions itself across your path. The occasional chirp or growl of a creature you'll never see, but whose scent lingers long after its paw prints are gone. By the second day, the oil begins to change. It darkens slightly, takes on a viscosity that surprises you. And when you test a drop on your wrist, you are met with a scent so peculiar, so fine, that you almost laugh. Not because it is beautiful, though it is, but because it is lonely. That is the only word for it. It smells like someone who has waited too long, like parchment stored in a locked chest, like a voice that once sang in a temple but hasn't dared speak since the walls crumbled. Historians still argue about whether dessert Lotus was ever truly used in perfumery. Some claim it was too rare, too impractical, while others insist it was reserved for the most private of rites, used only in spells of forgetting or remembrance, depending on the direction of the wind and the phase of the moon. One obscure scroll, found in a jar buried beneath a minor noblewoman's tomb, suggests it was used by widows preparing to remarry, added in tiny amounts to their bathwater to symbolize the closing of one chapter and the tentative beginning of another. Whatever the truth, you now understand why it was never widespread. It is not a scent for celebration or seduction. It is a scent for transition, for the threshold between what was and what might be. You bottle what you can, using a delicate reed funnel to transfer the oil without agitating it. Then cork it tightly and wrap it in goat wool, tucking it into the inner folds of your traveling sash, close to your heart. Not because you're sentimental, but because something about this scent feels fragile. Like if you don't carry it carefully, it will simply forget itself and dissolve. The journey home is slower, more thoughtful. Your cousin unusually quiet as well, perhaps sensing that something sacred has occurred. Though of course he masks it with jokes about camel breath and poorly cooked barley cakes. You smile politely, but your thoughts are on the vial, on what you will do with it, on who might be worthy to wear such a thing. Back in your workshop, under familiar shadows, and surrounded by the comforting clutter of your tools, you unseal the bottle once more and breathe it in. And for the briefest moment, you are back in the desert, kneeling beneath a silent sky, holding a flower that smelled like memory. And you think, maybe not all perfumes are meant to be worn. Maybe some are meant only to be remembered. Back in your workshop, where the walls once again pulse with the familiar warmth of day-old incense, and the ever-so-slight tang of copper still clinging to your alembic tubes, You find your hands moving through motions they know by heart, polishing glass bottles, sorting dried resins into small lacquered trays, pouring fine sand into shallow ceramic dishes to test the way it holds heat. But your mind, despite its best efforts, keeps wandering back to the vial of dessert lotus oil, now tucked gently into a velvet pouch inside a wooden drawer, marked only with a smudge of charcoal. Because there are some things too rare to name and too soft to expose to daylight chatter. It's not just the scent that stays with you, though that is part of it. The faint mineral hush, the papery breath of petals that never touched river water, but the way the entire experience settled into your skin, like memory does when it doesn't have words to become story. And so it hides instead in the bend of your elbow or the back of your throat, waiting for the right song or scent or silence to remind you that it was always there. You turn to more mundane orders, blending a fresh batch of the fig and clove balm requested by the Linen Dyers Guild, something to rub on hands raw from dye vats and saltwater scrubbing, and you weigh out the crushed fennel seed and bruised dates with practiced ease, adding just enough myrrh to keep the scent grounded, and a dash of cinnamon, not for perfume, but for morale. As the mixture warms over the brazier, its scent curls around your shoulders like an old friend with gossip to share. And for a moment, you allow yourself to sink into that comfort, to be soothed by the reliable, earthy aroma of things that do not demand poetry, only usefulness. Still, even as your fingers move with quiet efficiency, your thoughts keep slipping sideways, circling that old question. What makes a perfume worthy of remembrance? Is it the rarity of its ingredients? The hands that crafted it? The story it tells or refuses to tell? There's a phrase one of your older teachers used to say, often while rubbing a thumb across the rim of a nearly empty jar. Some perfumes don't speak. They haunt. At the time, you'd thought it dramatic, maybe a little too poetic for someone who once mistook mustard seed for poppy. But now you understand. The desert lotus doesn't announce itself. It lingers like an unfinished letter, the kind you keep meaning to send, but never quite do. And somehow, that makes it more powerful than anything that screams its beauty aloud. Later that afternoon, as the sun begins to slope toward the horizon and the day quiets into that golden stretch of sighs and shadows, a woman enters your workshop. Not hurriedly, not timidly, but with the calm assurance of someone who already knows the air will suit her. She wears robes of indigo and bronze, her wrists heavy with thin bangles that chime like cooled metal when she moves, and her gaze steady, curious, unblinking, settles on you, not as a customer might, but as an old friend might return to a familiar place, uncertain only of how much has changed. Without introduction, she picks up a small bottle from your shelf, uncorks it, sniffs, smiles faintly, and returns it without a word. It takes you longer than it should to place her. She was once a sinker, perhaps still is, known in the priestly circles not just for the clarity of her voice, but for the way she carried grief, like an ornament. Not flaunting it, but never hiding it either, letting it color her songs with a depth that could silence even the most inattentive festival crowd. You remember blending something for her once, an oil with juniper and frankincense, meant to be worn only during the slow descent of the sun on certain feast days, when the air smelled like baked dates and perfumed ash, and the priests chanted just slightly out of tune. Now she stands before you again, and when she speaks, her voice is the same as before. Low, warm, a little smoky around the edges, like old silk kept folded too long. "I've come," she says, "to ask you for a perfume that no one else will wear." You raise an eyebrow, not because it surprises you. After all, she always had a taste for solitude, but because you sense that what she means is not just uniqueness. She continues before you can ask. "I'm leaving the city," she says. There's nothing dramatic about it, no exile, no heartbreak. But I'm tired of being recognized by my earrings, tired of people expecting me to sound like I did 10 years ago. I want a scent that doesn't remember me, one that won't follow me like a shadow. You nod slowly, letting the request sink in. Most clients ask for the opposite. They want a signature, something that announces them before they speak, something lovers will remember long after they've left the room. But she wants erasure, or perhaps not erasure, but the freedom to become unmoored from the person people think she is. You think of the desert lotus again. You don't reach for it, not immediately, because even though your fingers itch with the temptation to offer it, you know that the right perfume cannot be given. It must be chosen or discovered or coaxed. Instead, you begin the process the way you always do with clients who cannot quite articulate what they want, by offering them contrasts. You place a dot of bergamot on her wrist. Too bright. She wrinkles her nose. You try cedar and orange blossom. Too sweet. Then vetiver. Too sharp. A mix of date syrup and crushed lentisk. She closes her eyes this time and murmurs, "Closer." And that's when you bring out the vial. You say nothing as you unstopper it, letting the oil breathe a moment, then place a single drop behind her ear. She goes still, then exhales. "I don't know what that is," she says quietly, "but it smells like something I used to believe." And that's when you know. You mix her a small batch, not the full desert lotus blend, but a diluted version anchored in figwood resin and a whisper of soaked barley, just enough to give it softness without clarity, like a voice heard through a veil. She insists on paying not in coin but in something stranger, a small chipped amulet shaped like a dove, carved from lapis lazuli, so dark it looks black in certain light. "I was given this when I first learned to sing," she says. "Now I give it to you. You don't argue." Some transactions are not about fairness. After she leaves, you place the amulet on your windowsill, where it catches the last light of day and reflects it in a muted shimmer, like a memory you're not quite sure you trust. You return to your notes, your vials, your ever-growing stack of half-finished blends and unlabeled bottles, and for the first time in a long while, you feel not just content, but necessary, because perhaps your work is not to preserve beauty or to chase rarity, but simply to hold space for those crossing thresholds, whether between cities, identities, seasons, or selves. And perfume, with all its invisibility, is the perfect companion for such journeys. It says nothing, but it remembers everything. You wake on the second day of the flood, not to the sound of rising water, but to a peculiar stillness, the kind that only occurs when the city, momentarily defeated by nature, stops pretending to be in control. The street outside your home, usually filled with the creak of wooden carts and the hollow slap of sandals on sun-warmed stone, is now muffled by silt and the slow, reluctant gurgle of canal runoff. In the distance, you can hear someone yelling about sandbags and another voice offering unsolicited advice about the proper placement of drainage channels. But you stay indoors, sipping barley tea from a cracked ceramic cup, staring at the shelves where your oils sit, sealed and dry, untouched by flood or fuss. This is the time of year when business slows, too humid for distilling, too damp for preserving, and too chaotic for customers to care much about smelling pleasant, when their courtyards are filling with water and their goats refuse to cross puddles wider than their own bodies. But for you, it's also a time of rare opportunity, because with everything slowed and softened by moisture, the scents of the city begin to change, to relax their usual sharpness, to mingle and melt together in ways you cannot plan for. Wood smoke mixed with wet clay, fermented grain hovering above soaked palms, rain-soaked linen blooming with the ghost of old sandalwood. You step outside barefoot, the cold mud curling around your toes, and breathe deeply, letting the confusion of aromas settle into your senses, like a riddle you won't solve today, but will file away for later, perhaps when the river recedes and the bottles call to be filled again. As the day stretches on, the clouds loosen their grip, and a thin gray light begins to sift down through the overhang of papyrus canopies and tattered awnings, revealing the city not as broken, but merely interrupted. And in that interruption, you see something beautiful. The way the water has polished every surface, the way mud clings to statues with a reverence that no priest ever manages, the way even the most serious temple scribe now tiptoes like a child through ankle-deep runoff, robes hiked to the knees, curses muttered, but never loud enough to challenge the sky. And it's in that softened version of your world that you get an idea. Not for a grand perfume, not something to send to nobles or temple dancers, but something small, humble, necessary. A scent for wet days. You've never been asked for one, of course. Most people think of perfume as a thing for sun and ceremony, for celebrations and seductions, but you've always known better. Some of your most loyal clients are those who ask for oils to wear during mourning, during fasts, during times of anxiety or loneliness. Scent, after all, does not discriminate. It does not wait for perfect weather. So why not make a blend for days like this? For weather that forces people to slow down, to stay indoors, to listen to themselves. You begin with something green, not fresh, not grassy, but the kind of green that lives beneath the surface, that smells of roots and memory. Crushed olive leaf provides a soft bitterness, grounding the blend. You add a pinch of fenugreek, soaked overnight and gently roasted, until its aroma deepens from sharp spice to soft earth. Then a whisper of marjoram, just enough to catch the nose's attention, and a few drops of aged date vinegar, not to sour the mix, but to give it a sense of age, of rainwater collected in a stone basin that hasn't been moved in a generation. But the heart of the blend is something you almost forget to include: soaked linen. It seems silly at first. Linen doesn't have a scent, people say. But they're wrong. Linen, when washed by river water, dried in the shade, then soaked again in storm, carries a scent so subtle you have to train your whole body to smell it. It smells like human skin, clean and tired. It smells like worry, softened by routine. It smells like the inside of your grandmother's robe, the one she wrapped you in during storms when the lightning made you flinch. You take a strip of old cloth, one that once lined a basket of lotus petals, and steep it in warm water. When you press your nose to the steam rising from the bowl, you smell history. Not grand, heroic history, but the kind that actually matters. The history of daily life, of survival, of continuing. You use that steam to soften your resin base, then add the rest slowly, stirring with a reed and humming under your breath. Not any song in particular, just a tune your mother used to hum when cleaning the corners of the house. No one ever thanked her for tending. The blend comes together easily, as if it had been waiting for you to notice it. When you test a drop on your wrist, you're surprised by how quiet it is. It doesn't rise to meet you. It stays close to the skin, warm and intimate. A scent not to announce, but to comfort. It smells like the space between tasks, the moment before sleep, the first sip of broth on a cold morning. You name it, silt. Historians still argue whether the ancient perfumers ever made blends for moments that were neither sacred nor erotic. Some believe all scent had to serve a higher function, be it religious, medicinal, or ceremonial. But you've always suspected otherwise. After all, why would someone spend 3 years perfecting a blend made entirely from roasted lentils, chamomile ash, and fig stem, if not simply to soothe the soul on a slow afternoon? And why else would the workers who built the pyramids have worn tiny cloth sachets under their armpits, scented with vinegar and mint, if not to comfort themselves between the heavy lifting hours? You seal your new blend in a squat, wide-mouthed jar, the kind meant for ointments rather than perfumes, and place it near the door. Not to sell, not yet, but to test. You want to see who notices it, who picks it up without meaning to, who sighs when they do, and you don't have to wait long. The next morning, the rain has passed, but the streets are still quiet, as if the city isn't quite sure it wants to start again. A boy comes in, maybe 10 years old, barefoot, and carrying a torn basket of herbs, mostly parsley, and 2 bruised lemons. He says nothing, just holds out a small clay token from his mother, a regular client who swears your basil salve helped her sleep through her grief, and waits for you to nod. You do, reaching for the jar, but as you turn, he catches a whiff of silt, still open from last night. "What's that?" he asks, nose twitching like a pup's. "Something for muddy days," you reply. He sniffs again, then shrugs. "Smells like my grandmother's porch," he says, "before she died." And that's when you know the blend works. Not because it pleased a scholar or a noble, but because it gave a child something he hadn't remembered he missed. You cork the jar and tuck it away, because this one isn't for sale. Not yet. Not until the next flood comes and the city once again softens at the edges. And someone, somewhere, asks for a perfume not to impress or inspire, but simply to feel less alone. You return to the river, not for business, Not for gathering, not even for scent, at least not at first, but because your feet carry you there one quiet morning, long after the flood has receded, and the streets have dried, and the neighbors resumed shouting across rooftops and negotiating loudly over fish and flour, long after the city has resumed its predictable, comforting clatter, and the perfume jars on your shelf no longer glisten with condensation, but sit proudly in the early light, their contents stable, measured, known. You go not because there is anything left to gather, but because you miss the unpredictability of water, the way it sometimes gives and sometimes it takes, the way it refuses to be rushed or defined. The Nile, in its laziness, has always been your best teacher, not through force or clarity, but through slow, persistent presence. You stand at the edge of the bank, where the mud gives way to reeds, and you let the breeze brush past your cheek, warm with dust and birdsong, and you breathe. Not deeply, not theatrically, but in the way you do when no one's watching and nothing is expected of you. A breath that is equal parts arrival and release. You kneel and run your fingers through the wet earth, thick with crushed papyrus and the faint tang of algae. And for a moment you wonder, if you were not a perfumer, who would you be? A cook, perhaps, seasoning silence instead of oil. A potter, shaping clay with fingers that never smell of frankincense. Or maybe nothing at all. Just a listener. A keeper of unsaid things. The thought doesn't linger, because the truth is you were always meant to be what you are, even if it began as an accident. Even if your first vial of oil turned rancid and your second batch smelled faintly of burnt leeks. You were meant to hold memory in liquid form, to coax scent from root and flower and ash, to bottle stories that cannot be told with words alone. You were meant, in the quietest of ways, to help people remember who they are, or forget, if they need to. As you stand, brushing the mud from your knees, you notice something curious. A small child crouched by the reeds, no more than 5 or 6, hands busy with something in the water. He's building a boat, or at least trying to, out of bundled stems and a bit of string. His tongue pokes from the corner of his mouth in concentration, and when he finally notices you, he doesn't startle or run, but simply nods, as if acknowledging another citizen of the riverside. "What are you making?" you ask, crouching beside him. "A boat," he replies, "for my sister. She's going to the city." There's no sadness in his voice, but something about the offering, this tiny, impermanent thing, destined to sink or drift away, makes your heart ache a little. "Does she like the river?" She says it smells different every time. You smile. She's right. And because you have no flowers, no oils, no materials on you, you do something you haven't done in a long time. You remove the tiny vial that hangs always beneath your tunic. Your first perfume, your flawed, too sweet, too bold beginning, and you unstopper it just slightly, letting a single drop fall onto the boy's woven reed. It darkens immediately, spreads like memory, and the boy sniffs once, then nods. "She'll know it's from me now." You hand him a strip of linen to wrap the boat and help him carry it to the slow edge of the current, where he releases it with both hands, palms opened. The boat turns once, then begins its lazy drift down river, not fast, not dramatic, but steady. You watch until it's gone. You return home slower than you arrived, because endings always take longer than beginnings. And you find that your feet are reluctant to turn corners, your shoulders unwilling to bear the usual weight of expectation. But when you reach your doorway, the city greets you not with noise, but with a moment of stillness, the kind that comes not from silence, but from everything falling into place. A neighbor waves, a cat yawns, a pot of lentils simmers somewhere, and the breeze brings with it a whiff of coriander and old wood smoke. Inside, your workshop is exactly as you left it. Jars labeled in charcoal ink, herbs drying in bundles, a stack of fresh clay discs waiting to be pressed with scent and offered as tokens to the curious or the grieving or the simply bored. You sit at your bench, the wood warm from the morning sun, and you do not rush to blend or bottle. You simply sit, letting the weight of years settle around you like a cloak. Historians still argue about the purpose of perfumers in ancient Egypt. Some say you were servants of the gods, crafting sacred blends for anointing statues and embalming pharaohs. Others claim you were more like artists, artisans whose senses were trained beyond the ordinary, gifted with the strange task of capturing moments in liquid form. A few scholars suggest you were merely tradespeople, clever with your fingers and keen on profit, mixing pleasant things to please difficult people. And perhaps, in some way, all of these are true, but none of them capture this quiet, this ritual, this life. Because what they miss, what no scroll or papyrus ever says, is that perfume is not just a craft or a trade or even an art. It is a rhythm, a companion, a way of noticing the world more deeply. It is the space between pulses, the scent of a goodbye not spoken aloud, the presence of a hand no longer held, the breath before a new story begins. And now as the light climbs higher, you rise, not hurried, not burdened, and you open the window, letting the wind play its strange little game through your hanging strips of linen, rustling the notes on your wall, scattering the petals from a bowl you forgot to cover. You laugh quietly to yourself. There is always something unfinished, always something to remember. And with that thought, you reach for your mortar and your small knife, and you begin again. Now the air is quiet, the sun a golden hush against your skin, and the jars sit peacefully on their shelves, full of stories that no longer demand to be told, only remembered in whispers of clove, sandalwood, and dreams. You feel the stillness settle around your shoulders, like a soft shawl woven from dusk and old songs and the breath of lotus petals that bloomed in the dark. The day has lengthened, its work done, its rhythm softened, and you let your body follow that same slow curve toward rest. Your thoughts drifting not like the sharp notes of citrus or pepper, but like the lingering warmth of fig and honey, the kind of scent that clings to the folds of your robe long after the memory has passed. The river, somewhere out there in the night, moves with its ancient confidence, washing the banks of your sleep with gentle laps and the soft voice of 1,000 years, reminding you that even in forgetting, there is presence. Even in stillness, there is movement. Even in silence, something is always steeping, always infusing. And so you close your eyes. The scents remain, not loud, not bold, not even clear, but soft and sure, like footsteps on sand that hasn't seen rain in a decade, like the softest parts of your name spoken in a dream. You breathe in, then again. Slower now. No need to gather, to measure, to perfect. It's all already here. Sleep now, perfumer. The story can wait.